Well, welcome. My name is Jill Belsky, and I'm a professor in the College of Forestry and Conservation here at the University of Montana, and I'm also the director of the Boley Center for People and Forests. Tonight, we have assembled a diverse panel to discuss the recently announced new planning rule for the United States Department of Agriculture Forest Service. But before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the assistance of Martin Nye and Theron Miller. Where's Theron? Right over there. Also with me at the Boley Center for helping to put this event together. I'd also like to acknowledge Dean Perry Brown. Where'd you go? You were here. There he is. And our Associate Dean, Jim Birchfield, who will be here pretty soon, I think, at the College of Forestry and Conservation for their ongoing and instrumental support of all things related to people and forests. The title of our panel tonight is the United States Forest Service Planning Rules, What They Mean, and Why Do They Matter? As many of you know, the USDA Forest Service announced its new planning rule on December 22, 2004. This new rule represents the latest chapter in ongoing debates over how to manage our country's national forests. A significant change occurred in the 1970s with the passage of the National Forest Management Act of 1976, abbreviated as NIFMA. NIFMA requires the Forest Service to prepare long-term integrated plans for each national forest. This planning process transformed the forest policy process by dramatically expanding opportunities for public participation and for greater involvement of the courts and for scientists. The adoption of NIFMA created some important standards in forest management, but how its statutory directives would be achieved has been largely left to specific provisions which have been fleshed out in its implementing regulations. This has been done in 1979, 1982, 2000, and most recently at the end of 2004. These implementing regulations have contained legally enforceable provisions that have proven to be key in recent conflicts over how our national forests will be managed. They have mattered a lot. We're here tonight to hear how people from different backgrounds and with varying perspectives interpret what the new rule means and how it potentially matters. I think it's particularly fitting for this discussion to be organized by the Boley Center for People and Forests. The late Arnold Boley, for whom this center is named, was a former dean of the School of Forestry here at UM, and he provided a key spark for what eventually became the National Forest Management Act of 1976. While it is debatable what Dean Boley might say about the 2004 regulations, everyone who knew him personally or read his works knows that he would most definitely demand a vigorous debate and public exchange about them. That is his legacy, and that's the task before us tonight. I will introduce each panelist. Each will speak for 15 to 20 minutes. To keep us on this time frame, I'll alert you with my super duper color-coded cards. I've learned something as being a professor. I will alert you when you each have a few minutes left. I ask the audience to please hold your questions until each of the panelists have spoken. After each has spoken, we'll open up for questions and answer. And we have a microphone set over on the side of the aisle over there. So I would ask that you would queue up behind the microphone. And when it's your turn, you may make a comment or ask a question. And we ask, whichever you do, to just please keep these comments or questions brief and to the point. We're going to begin then with our first panelist, Pam Gardiner. Pam is currently the Director of Ecosystem Assessment and Planning for the Northern Region of the Forest Service here in Missoula. She has served with the Forest Service for 29 years, starting as a volunteer in 1976, the year NIFMA was passed. She's worked on national forests in Oregon, California, Wisconsin, New Hampshire, and Utah, and most recently in Washington, D.C. She came to her current position in Missoula just this October. She has served as planning staff at the forest, regional, and national levels, plus 10 years as a district ranger, and 6 as a Deputy Forest Supervisor. Please, Pam Gardner.
I think I'll just hold this. Thank you. Good evening. I wanted to begin by thanking the Boley Center and my fellow panelists and all of you for coming out this evening. The subject is one that obviously is of great interest to those of us who care about the national forests and their future. As Jill mentioned, tonight we're talking about a major event in the history of the national forests, and that is the publication of new planning regulations announced in December and published in January of this year. Let me try to get this out of. We'll see if, can you still hear? Okay. As Jill mentioned, the National Forest Management Act was passed in 1976. That law required for the first time that integrated long-term planning be done for every unit of the National Forest System. We've been operating under the same set of regulations governing that planning since 1982. For that reason, this new rule is a big deal. It's a big deal for the agency, and it's a big deal for the public. I've been asked tonight to share the perspective of the Forest Service on this new rule by addressing 3 primary questions. First, who wrote this rule, and why did they write it? Secondly, what does it mean? And third, how will this rule affect the national forests of the northern region? The first question is fairly easy for me to answer. This rule was written by the Forest Service. The reason I know that is that for the past 3 years I was in Washington, D.C., sitting in the cubicle next to the person who was one of the primary authors of the rule. I saw people working round the clock for the last 3 or 4 years, sending drafts out to their counterparts in regional offices like the one here in Missoula, getting feedback, having meetings, more meetings, more meetings, and more meetings. It's been a labor of love and a labor of struggle, and it represents excellent thinking on the part of many dedicated professionals who have each spent their entire careers working in planning on national forests. The question why it was written is also something that could be either very simple or very complex, but in summary, it was written to deal with the lessons that we have learned through more than 20 years of working with the National Forest Management Act and the 1982 rule. Those lessons are complex, but they fall into 3 broad categories. First, we learned that long-term planning should be strategic rather than tactical. When we began, we thought that the long-term management plans authorized under NFMA might be able to authorize 10 to 15 years worth of management projects for the ground. As a result, we generated long lists of possible projects. We evaluated what we thought would be their environmental effects. We generated tables and matrices and ran linear programs and had piles of computer paper on the floor in the morning after sending them overnight to be processed by large computers miles and miles away. And when we were done, we had documents that often weighed in excess of 10 pounds that very few people were willing to read and that were outdated the day after they were published. The reason we think for that having been the case is that it isn't practical to try to develop tactical plans that address the long term and the large scale. The new rule emphasizes the strategic nature of planning. It sets forth 4 primary components for strategic plans. The first component is a detailed description of desired conditions with the intent of aiming the national forest in a particular direction over the coming 10 to 15 years and by inference beyond that. The plan is intended to describe land suitability for a variety of uses. It sets measurable objectives that would enable the national forest to move toward desired conditions and describes guidelines for projects and activities to follow, but those projects and activities are seen as part of later decision-making steps. So lesson number 1, be strategic. Secondly, we learned that planning should be adaptive. The reason for that is that circumstances changed more quickly than our planning process was able to manage. As many of you are aware, for example, recreation activities have changed a lot in the last 10 to 15 years. There's new recreational equipment, new interests on the part of the public, and the types of decisions that were made 15 years ago often don't deal with the explosion in certain kinds of recreation. And yet it's very difficult to make the changes necessary to manage that change. Another example is that large disturbances can occur, such as wildfires, floods, and insect and disease epidemics. Those circumstances can change the picture against which the original plans were developed and agreed to. And other examples include the creation of new conservation strategies for wildlife and fish, and scientific findings that lead to the need to expand our options for management of wildfire and, for example, to introduce wildfire into the ecosystem. Those types of changes have not been easy to incorporate into plans under the current model. It's not unusual for a major amendment to take 2 or 3 or more, even more years than that. Revisions can take up to 10 years. The 2 national forests I worked on before going to Washington have been in the revision process for 8 and 9 years, respectively, before they were able to produce a record of decision. The new rule provides us with a more adaptive model, and hopefully will be one in which we can keep plans current. Third, we learned that the public needed to be engaged throughout the planning process. Under the 1982 rule, the public was intended by design to be involved twice in the planning process. The first time was at the initiation of planning with a process known as scoping, and the second time was at the review of a draft environmental impact statement. It was, of course, expected that those 2 events would come in relatively close succession. In fact, they were often separated by many years. When I was a planner on the Inyo National Forest in California, scoping took place in 1979. We published the draft in 1986. People had moved, people had changed, people had moved into the area and had not yet been involved in the planning process when the draft was published. So we realized that this type of episodic public involvement is not the best way to engage the citizens in the management of their national forests or in long-term planning for their forests. Meaningful involvement should be continual and it should be interactive. So those are the main reasons that we felt the need to write a new planning rule after having experienced the other one. So given that history, the question was asked, what does the new rule mean to the public and to the Forest Service? That question is impossible to answer briefly, and in many ways the answer will depend on how we work together with this new approach to planning in coming years. However, I would like to highlight 4 key points in response to issues that have been raised since the rule was published. First, the public will have ample opportunity for involvement. There are more public involvement requirements under the new rule than there were under the 1982 rule or under the National Environmental Policy Act itself. Every step of the planning process is intended to involve the public. At the initiation of planning or plan revision, we intend to have a comprehensive evaluation of current conditions and trends. The public will be involved in the comprehensive evaluation. Those evaluations will be repeated at least every 5 years. The public is intended to be involved in those. The public will be involved in the design of the plan, of the 4 components I mentioned earlier, in the design of the monitoring program, and in actual monitoring of progress on the ground. Secondly, environmental safeguards remain in place. There's been a lot of concern about the possibility that this rule represents a change in our commitment to the protection of the environment. All substantive environmental laws continue to apply, although in some cases the details and procedures of how they will be applied might be different at the planning stage. Third, planning will meet all of the requirements of NEPA. The National Environmental Policy Act, which requires a detailed environmental analysis of federal actions that significantly affect the environment will be applied both at the plan stage and at the project stage. However, we believe that the plan itself may well qualify for a category in the National Environmental Policy Act regulations called a categorical exclusion from the preparation of an environmental impact statement. The reason that we believe that is true is that the plan itself does not authorize activities that have the potential to affect the environment. We believe that it sets the stage, the strategic background for those activities, but that until a final decision is made on an activity or a project, that the effects cannot be meaningfully evaluated. Anything that has that potential, such as timber harvesting, mining, ski area development, recreation development, will then require a full-blown environmental study as they do today. Nothing has changed with regard to the requirements for authorizing projects. Finally, planning will continue to include large-scale data collection and a data analysis. The fact that we do not intend to prepare an environmental impact statement for every plan does not mean that we will abandon the idea of using integrated data across large landscapes and analysis of the implications of that data. Comprehensive evaluations will occur at the beginning of revision and every 5 years thereafter. Finally, I was asked, what is the impact of this rule for the national forest and grassland in the northern region? The region has 9 national forests in Montana, 3 in Idaho, and a national grassland in North Dakota. The Dakota Prairie Grasslands have already revised their plan. This rule does not affect them immediately. 8 units are in the process of revising as we speak. 5 of those in Montana, 3 in Idaho. 4 of the forests in Montana have not yet begun revision. The regional forester and the forest supervisors will soon decide which rule to follow for the 8 national forests currently in revision. We're involved in ongoing conversations, have a lot of issues that we want to make sure to address before we make a final decision. We expect that decision within the next few weeks. We're leaning toward remaining with the 1982 rule for the Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forests because they're very close to publishing draft documents. On the other hand, we're leaning toward transition to the new rule for the remaining 7 forests, but have several questions we're still researching before we make a decision. So, I've presented a few thoughts on how the Forest Service sees our new planning process. I know that others on this panel and in this audience have different views. That's natural, it's part of the democratic process, and we're stronger for that. I look forward to engaging in this discussion tonight and as we move forward into the future. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Martin Nye. Martin is Associate Professor of Natural Resource Policy in the College of Forestry and Conservation here at UM. His teaching responsibilities and research interests are in the areas of environmental and natural resources policy, law, and administration with a focus on public lands and wildlife. Nye has a particular interest in natural resource-based political conflict, and his current research agenda examines public lands governance, the political institutions and decision-making processes used to handle difficult policy problems. He received his PhD from Northern Arizona University. Professor Nye? I need to clip you in.
Thanks a lot. Well, I'm going to try to read way too much too quickly, but I thought this might save us some time, so I apologize for any boredom. But let me. My goal this evening, I guess, is to provide a big picture look at the 2005 planning regulations and place them in the context of political conflict and public lands governance. I trust that fellow panelists will mix it up when it comes to the details, and I hope to join the fray if possible. But I also think it serves us well to evaluate the important assumptions, arguments, and ideas serving as the foundation of these regulations. And that is what I will focus on this evening. Please be warned, however, that I am not a forest planner, nor have I ever appealed or sued the Forest Service. Though if properly trained, I always thought it would be fun to sue the former chief. Known around here as Versus Thomas. But as a policy analyst trained in political science, and a citizen whom is passionate about our public lands and sustainable rural communities, I feel that I can offer something when it comes to political conflict and the institutions and decision-making processes used to govern our national forests. At this point, many conflicts over forest management are irrepressible. Therefore, changes in political institutions and decision-making processes may simply shift conflicts from one venue to another. I will call this the whack-a-mole principle, because of its similarity to the game that you can play at the Montana Fair, where you try to smash in a mole only to find it popping its head up in another unpredictable place. Likewise, I think suppressing conflict in one venue will likely result in its emergence someplace else. The Forest Service has recently adopted a new set of planning regulations that it believes constitute, quote, a paradigm shift in land management planning. While the National Forest Management Act provides an important framework and sets enforceable parameters, the Bush administration, like its predecessor, tries to stamp its values and philosophy onto NIFMA's planning regulations. What we have seen then is the venue of conflict shifting from Congress to rulemaking to the planning process. The 2000 planning regs, promulgated under President Clinton and drafted by using another committee of scientists, emphasized ecological sustainability above all else. The 2005 Rules Foundation, on the other hand, is maximum administrative discretion and decision-making efficiency. The Forest Service wants to be unshackled from traditional NEPA-based planning procedures so it can utilize its expertise and respond to new problems, science, and information more expeditiously. In a strange twist, the agency that once sold forest planning as the answer to our problems is now admitting that it did not work as intended. In hindsight, it seems to believe that previous planning regulations created too many substantive and procedural hooks that could be used against the agency, like the viable population requirement that caused so much controversy in the Pacific Northwest. Instead of legally enforceable standards then, the 2005 planning regs largely consist of general recommendations with the word should instead of shall in various parts of the rule. The permissive language is chosen to make it harder to administratively challenge and sue the Forest Service. It views forest plans as strategic and aspirational documents, thus requiring no alternatives to be considered and environmental analysis required at this stage. When it comes to the principal components of planning, its mantra is always the same. They are, quote, aspirational, but are neither commitments nor final decisions approving projects or activities. This is the sort of non-committal language, by the way, that any sane parent quickly learns to memorize. That this is not a final decision, I'm not committing myself to anything. The analysis and hard work, including cumulative effects analysis, will be shifted to the project level in the use of new 5-year comprehensive evaluations. But even at this level, forest managers will have increased discretion. With this much focus on the project level, many actors will continue to complain of the agency's unwillingness to look at the big picture and the ongoing, quote, tyranny of small decisions. In other words, the Forest Service could implement a forest plan by taking a number of discrete steps that may seem reasonable when viewed in isolation, but problematic when seen in context. Nevertheless, plans will continue to set individual forests in a particular direction. From a conflict perspective, the key term in the regulations is desired conditions, defined as the, quote, the social, economic, and ecological attributes to which management of the land and resources of the plan area is to be directed. But conflicts often boil down to fundamentally different desired conditions, with conservationists often wanting less human management and human manipulation of roadless forests, and the Forest Service and timber industry wanting more. Even the term desired conditions is loaded, moreover, as the Forest Service has historically viewed timber sales as, quote, the most economically viable means of achieving desired plant and animal diversity. That's Sierra Club v. Robertson, 1994. Understanding that the agency should not act alone, collaboration with the public is put forth as one way that these desired future conditions will be determined. Hopefully so. But just as likely is the continuation of higher level decision making for which the rule explicitly allows. After all, the public may simply respond to a vision drawn by the Forest Service, and they will have little incentive to collaborate if they believe key decisions have already been made. In short, the Forest Service will get to define desired conditions, and it will be less unfettered in determining what these conditions look like and how they will be achieved. So what should we make of this administrative reform? Let us start by analyzing what I consider to be the four core principles on which it is based: efficiency, administrative discretion, the localization of forest management, and adaptability. They are central to public lands governance in general. First, talk about streamlining, paper pushing, and analysis paralysis is built upon the notion of decision-making efficiency. That is, forest policy and management is inefficient and must therefore be fixed by giving managers more discretion, streamlining environmental review, and other things. There is nothing inherently bad about efficiency, of course. Once I make the decision to bike to work, I cut corners. But let me suggest that efficiency is the wrong way to think about forest policy and management at the moment. The Forest Service, Congress, and the public at large are engaged in a fundamental conflict over the future, values, and purpose of the forest system. Why emphasize efficiency when we do not agree on what we want to be efficient at? Think about abortion and the death penalty. Would it be of any use to talk about the most efficient way of getting an abortion or killing someone if the person you are trying to convince believes that all life is sacred? What we presently need most is not more efficiency, but more effective and constructive dialogue about the future of our forests and environment. Floundering rural communities, trends in motorized recreation, habitat, global markets, trade deals, and a host of other issues should be front and center, not efficiency. It is only once we agree on the ends of forest policy that efficiency becomes relevant as a means to achieve them. On the other hand, there is certainly something wrong with the status quo on some forest units. Most people will agree that a planning process should be shorter than a plan's life cycle. Nor does it make sense to spend this much time and resources on a plan that is seen by the agency as nothing more than aspirational. Something has got to give. But there's also the question of whether or not the regulations will even increase efficiency. The general planning process might be fast-tracked, but projects might get further bogged down in analytical requirements, including cumulative effects analysis and other procedural guidelines. As for administrative discretion, we must remember that it always cuts both ways. The Forest Service is controlled by the executive branch. So while discretion may look appealing now, at least to some interests, it could be viewed differently under different presidential leadership. Terms like desired conditions, collaboration, best available science, adaptive management, and sustainability are flexible enough to fit the most preservationist or utilitarian of presidents. A White House bent on preserving national forests from resource use could do wonders with such language, as could a more industry-friendly one. So be careful what you wish for, in other words. Notwithstanding top-down political and budgetary pressure, this level of discretion will certainly be used in different ways, depending on the background values and management style of the responsible official, like a regional forester, supervisor, or district ranger. If permitted by higher-level decision makers, some officials may use the space afforded by the regulations to harvest as much timber as they can, citing the call for healthy forests or economic sustainability for justification. Others, however, may use this discretion in very innovative ways, be it with public participation, collaboration, advisory councils, monitoring programs, and the best use of available science. The discretion may result in a surprising level of problem solving and street level administrative leadership. The Forest Service is not monolithic in its views and values, so in the end, with this much discretion, what happens will depend on the person at the point of power, and politics always flows to this level. There is also some question as to whether the regulations are contrary to the letter and spirit of NIFMA. While its intent is debatable, it is groundless to argue that NIFMA passed as a way to lessen the standards in place at the time and give the Forest Service increased discretion. Such unbridled discretion was the problem and not the solution, according to NIFMA's primary architects. Though planning took precedence, judicially enforceable standards, albeit of questionable value, were written into NIFMA as a way to check the unquestioned professional judgment of the Forest Service. The act was supposed to get the forests out of the courts, but only because the new standards would conceivably provide the direction necessary to stay out of them. In any case, the courts will ultimately decide. Though higher level decisions will continue to be made, the 2005 regs attempt to localize forest conflict and management. In theory, again, it places regional foresters, supervisors, and district rangers in the driver's seat. And this is what scares skeptics, for conservationists have put forth a concerted effort to nationalize forest conflicts. Furthermore, critics worry that decision makers will once again be captured by the forest products industry and commercial interests while facing intense local pressure to manage for these so-called clients. Without as many enforceable standards, budgetary incentives to harvest more timber may play a bigger role in the future as well, as officials will have less leverage to balance congressional budgetary pressure with their legal obligations. On the other hand, with appropriate bureaucratic leadership, localizing some forest disputes could foster increased trust among adversaries, more productive relationships, and better problem solving, drainage by drainage. Again, with this much discretion, it will depend on who's in charge. Finally, on paper at least, the regulations, including the communications preceding them, signify that the Forest Service is rethinking public lands governance and the potential of adaptive management. The 2005 regs might represent an attempt to implement the widespread demand for increased adaptability and monitoring by various academics and practitioners, whom have long noted the problems often resulting from the one-time decision prediction-based NEPA model. Its call for adaptive management, for example, stems from the Committee of Scientists report and dozens of scholarly books and articles focusing on this approach to resources planning. In fact, the streamlining and discretion included in the regulations, including the expedited use of the Forest Directive System and the monitoring program, if funded, may prove to be an ingenious way of practicing the theory of adaptive management in a messy administrative state. Of course, it could also prove to be airy rhetoric, simply disguising an old wise use management philosophy. And perhaps its method of implementation, a corporate-like environmental management systems model, will merely result in increased paperwork, confusion, and a new area of environmental litigation. Only time will tell. Thank you.
Our third speaker tonight is Julia Altimus. Julia has over 14 years' experience in the energy natural resource field as congressional staff to the United States Senate and United States House of Representatives. And in February of 2003, she joined the staff of the Montana Logging Association as the resource specialist. She has worked on various natural resource issues affecting public land management policy, such as timber salvage riders, the categorical exclusion rule, extension of the stewardship contracting program, the U.S. Geological Survey Grizzly Bear DNA study, the bull trout proposed critical habitat and draft recovery plan, and many others. She has also worked on the Kootenai Accords, the Montana Wilderness Legislation, the National Fire Plan, and the Western Governors 10-year comprehensive strategy. Julia is a member of the Western Governors Association Healthy Forest Advisory Committee, the Montana Forest Council, the Montana Forest Stewardship Committee, and the Montana Congressional Small Mill Task Force. Please come up. Thank you.
Well, thanks for the invitation to be here tonight. I appreciate this is a really important issue and one that we have been watching very closely for a long time. The Montana Logging Association represents over 600 independent logging contractors, each of which operate a family-owned enterprise that harvests and/or transports timber from forest to mill. In Montana, the vast majority of timberland is owned by the government agencies, most notably the U.S. Forest Service. The welfare of the MLA membership is directly impacted by federal land management policies and directives. Therefore, it is with keen interest that we have monitored and reviewed the release of the new 2005 planning rule. It appears that the new rule is not the next evolutionary process in forest planning. Rather, the new rule is revolutionary change in the way the U.S. Forest Service approaches management planning and long-term ecosystem sustainability. As has been previously mentioned, on January 5, 2005, the Forest Service published a notice to rescind the 2000 rule and to establish a new 2005 planning rule. Along with establishing the new planning rule, notice was published proposing revision of the Forest Service NEPA handbook, proposing the use of categorical exclusions in accepting land and resource management plans from an EIS or an EA. Certainly a fundamental change in how national forest plans are revised and amended. The Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act of 1960 and the National Forest Management Act of 1976 mandate that the national forests are established and shall be administered for outdoor recreation, range, timber, watershed, and for fish and wildlife purposes. Resources are to be managed so they are utilized in combination that will best meet the needs of the American people. The new rule suggests that the concept that a forest plan will contribute to three interrelated and interdependent elements of sustainability: social, economic, and ecological. The overall goal of managing the national forest system is to sustain in perpetuity the productivity of the land and the multiple uses of its renewable resources. Maintaining or restoring the health of the land enables the national forest system to provide a sustainable flow of uses, values, benefits, products, services, and recreational opportunities. Because social and economic and ecological systems are complex and fluid, sustainability cannot be established as a specific condition for a particular place in time. Rather, current conditions and trends over time are used to gauge progress in achieving long-term social, economic, and ecological goals that indicate sustainability. A sustainable system is not just a catchphrase to indicate goods that are harvested and traded in a local economy, but inclusive within a sustainable system is the beneficial ecological attributes such as clean water, clean air, resilience to disturbances, a diverse ecosystem, and a desirable landscape for recreation and aesthetics. Tonight, we are here to discuss some pros and cons of this revolutionary new planning rule. There are several differences in the new planning rule that we do support, such as the fact that plans will be developed as strategic documents, meaning most plans will not require an EIS or an EA to comply with NEPA. Plans will comply with NEPA through a categorical exclusion, however. Forest Service professionals and the public will design plans collaboratively. The approach to plant and animal diversity focuses on ecosystem diversity with additional protection for species not covered by the ecosystem coarse and fine filters. The development of the environmental management system first surfaced under the Clinton administration and has been successfully used in other federal agencies and on industrial private timberlands. The MS is not to replace NEPA. The MS will identify environmental aspects and significant environmental impacts associated with ongoing activities, as well as with new proposals. NEPA will still provide impact prediction and mitigation at the design and decision phase. We are very supportive of the development of an EMS on forest system lands. The use of an EMS will require evaluating and monitoring how forests can respond to change on the landscape more quickly in order to protect or to restore diversity and sustainability. And before approving a plan, the public will be provided a 30-day pre-decisional objection period, removing the post-decisional appeal. We also support the rescission of the analysis of the management situation, viable populations, the management indicator species, standards, EIS documents, and the allowable sale quantity. In their place, we support that the new planning rule requires evaluation reports, conditions and trends, species diversity, species of concern, suitability of areas, special areas, guidelines, and categorical exclusions. The nature of planning will be a strategic guide for designing specific projects. Project design will refer to the plan's guidelines as design criteria to achieve desired future conditions. Public involvement and analysis will inform subsequent decisions at the project activity level. This is where environmental effect analysis becomes meaningful. Plan components will consist of desired conditions, where the social, economic, and ecological attributes guide land management and resource allocations. Objectives, where concise, time-specific intended outcomes are measured. Guidelines, where information and guidance on a project and activity are at the decision-making level. Suitability of areas, where an area is considered generally suitable for uses that are compatible with desired conditions and objectives for that area, and special areas, where areas within the National Forest System are designated for the unique or special characteristics, including statutorily and administratively designated areas. And finally, we support the use of collaboration, requiring the responsible line officer must use a collaborative and participatory approach in planning. Public involvement must take place during the evaluation report, the plan, the design, and the monitoring program. We firmly believe that management is more dynamic and strategic in nature when closest to the ground. Development of a more fluid rule that stems from a framework of what can be done instead of what can't be done, and injecting that framework with accountability and measured outputs is a direction we are eager to watch.
Our next speaker is Timothy Presso. Timothy graduated from Georgetown University Law Center in 1994. He clerked for Judge Henry T. Edwards of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit from 1994 to 1995. And he's practiced law with a private firm in Washington, D.C. for 4.5 years before taking a position as a staff attorney in the Bozeman Office of Earthjustice in 2000. Timothy?
Thank you. I should say, don't let the reference to Washington, D.C. fool you. I'm not some elitist Easterner here to enforce my wild views on New York public lands. I grew up in northeastern Oregon between two tiny little timber and ranching towns called Enterprise and Joseph, so I'm familiar with the small town western view of natural resource issues. And while I may not be the most honored graduate of my high school at this point, I think that I've seen a lot of these issues from a number of different sides. So I should also say that in terms of suing the Forest Service, I have done so. I admit to that and look forward to doing so again. And in that regard, presently, I'm counsel in a case called Defenders of Wildlife versus Johans, which is pending in the Federal District Court in San Francisco, California, which is the first challenge to the new 2005 NIFMA planning rule. So that the rule that we're talking about tonight is currently subject of a lawsuit. While I appreciate all the hard work that Ms. Gardner's fellow planners did in Washington, D.C., I hope they're back to the drawing board before too long, and I intend to do everything I can to see that will happen. And why is that? You know, all joking aside, it's because this rule abandons all standards in national forest management. Standards that can be understood and implemented by the agency, and standards that can be understood and counted on and enforced by the public. The basic rules of the road for national forest management have been thrown out the window with this rule revision. And we don't think that's appropriate, and we also don't think that's what Congress had in mind when it passed the National Forest Management Act. As Professor Nye said, the NIFMA grew out of a dispute over logging. And what NIFMA was designed to do was to reform Forest Service management by subjecting logging to new controls and by elevating the importance of other resources, wildlife, soils, water quality, in the Forest Service decision-making process. In that regard, forest plans under NIFMA were supposed to mean something. And they were supposed to enact important standards to guide national forest management that the public could count on. And that would reform what Congress felt was an agency that, subject to its own completely unfettered discretion, was too often making the wrong choices. To that end, NIFMA required a series of regulatory guarantees and restrictions that would be clear to the public and that would bind the agency to fulfill certain obligations in the forest plans. Some of those things are very fundamental, things that we take for granted as being sort of basic national forest management now, but that were part of the NIFMA statutory reform. Things such as that logging would be allowed only where soil, slopes, and watersheds would not be irreparably harmed. That logging would occur only where the lands that were logged could be restocked successfully within 5 years. That logging would occur only where streams and shorelines and wetlands were protected. And Congress specifically called on the Forest Service to set size limits for clear cuts in the national forest based on the specific characteristics of the forests in various geographic areas. And for 20 years, the Forest Service had done just that under the 1982 rules that have generally guided the current set of forest plans. Now, these new regulations decide to get rid of all that. They are, by their own admission, a paradigm shift. Unfortunately, nobody in the Forest Service bothered to tell Congress it was time for a paradigm shift in national forest management. So these rules chart new territory, but in so doing, they leave their statutory underpinnings behind. Well, Congress called for the regulations to embody the kinds of limitations I just described for you. The new regulation says merely that the chief of the Forest Service must include in the Forest Service directive system procedures to ensure that plans meet these NIFMA requirements. So the new regs take all of those standards that Congress enacted or Congress called for out of the regulations themselves and say, well, we'll deal with it in some forthcoming directive system, internal agency directives. So what's wrong with that? Why is it a big deal? It's a regulation, it's a directive, who cares? What's the difference? Well, there's a big difference. A regulation is the law. A regulation can be enforced. You as a citizen, whether you're an off-road vehicle rider or an environmentalist or a logger, can go to court and make sure that the agency follows something that's in a regulation. A directive, on the other hand, many courts have held that those directives are not judicially enforceable. So while a regulation is the law, a directive is sort of the legal equivalent of a New Year's resolution. Sort of a promise you make to yourself, you kind of mean it. Things don't go right, well, you know, nobody's going to hold you to account for it if you decide just to discard it and let it go by the wayside. So there's no consequence if the agency violates a directive as opposed to regulation. But you know, the Forest Service says, well, hey, don't worry about it. We don't have any bad intentions. You know, what's the problem here? Well, you know, it's kind of like a situation where, you know, if you took your car to the mechanic and the mechanic said, well, I'm happy to work on your car, but I'd really like to get rid of this clause in our standard contract that says I'll be liable for negligence. I'm not going to be negligent, don't worry about it, but you know, let's just get rid of that because it's kind of bothersome. I mean, it's the kind of thing where the reason we have these kinds of restrictions is so that we're not always left to the good faith of agency folks in the field, all of whom I'm sure are dedicated public employees, but many of whom have shown over time they don't always make the choices that at least large segments of the public would agree with. That's why we have guarantees in the law to make sure that things like wildlife and water quality and soils and wetlands are protected in the scheme of national forest management. The new regulations get rid of that. Another key example is in the area of wildlife protection. For 20 years since the Reagan administration, that wild-eyed bunch of environmentalists, the NIFMA regulations have provided that, quote, fish and wildlife habitat shall be managed to maintain viable populations of existing native and desired non-native vertebrate species in the planning area. That's a mouthful, but what it basically means is we're going to manage the national forest in a way that will preserve wildlife. We're not going to exterminate wildlife in the national forest. It's an important supplement to the protections of the Endangered Species Act. If you think of the Endangered Species Act as like the emergency room where wildlife species get rushed into when, you know, things hit the skids, the viability guarantee in these regulations for 20 years has been kind of like the wellness program. It is a way of making sure that we didn't get to the point where we had to call in the Endangered Species Act and its requirements. You know, the Forest Service has, in the new regulations, completely abandoned any kind of viability guarantee. The agency has had some problems with how the viability regulation was framed, and they've complained that it was impossible to meet. But rather than reforming it to meet those concerns, they just tossed it out the door altogether. And what they've replaced it with, near as I can tell, is mush. In place of the guarantee of viable wildlife populations, the new section 219.10 states, and I quote, that, quote, plan components must establish a framework to provide the characteristics of ecosystem diversity in the plan area. Well, I have no idea what a framework to provide the characteristics of ecosystem diversity is, other than something the Forest Service doesn't think it can be sued on. But I'm pretty sure it's not a guarantee that the Forest Service won't be pushing wildlife past the point of viability in the national forest. But again, it's sort of like the Forest, hey, we're not trying to move back from environmental protection. Why should people be concerned? Well, again, if you don't intend to push wildlife past the point of viability, then why do you need to get rid of a wildlife viability guarantee? Perversely, this leaves the Endangered Species Act as the sole legal safety net for wildlife in the national forest, just at the time that the Forest Service is increasingly complaining about the, quote, heavy hand of the Endangered Species Act. It's a little bit like deciding to adopt a diet of cheeseburgers for every meal and then complaining about how unpleasant the treatment is when you're rushed into the intensive care unit. That's kind of the situation the Forest Service has set up for itself. Then there's the issue of how meaningful these plans are going to be. Regardless of what they say about wildlife or any other resource, as several panelists have already said, under the new regulations, these plans are supposed to be strategic and aspirational rather than prescriptive. In other words, they'll articulate a vision rather than make for site-specific land management decisions. And on this basis, they claim that the new plans do not need to be subjected to the environmental analysis requirement of the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. This is basically one of many efforts underway by this administration to get the Forest Service out from under NEPA, which they view as sort of meaningless red tape as opposed to an important opportunity to weigh the benefits and detriments of a given course of conduct. NEPA is one of our basic environmental laws, and it embodies a simple principle, which is look before you leap. Evaluate what the impacts are going to be of a given action before you approve it. For the past 20 years, this NEPA process has served as an important vehicle for public involvement in and public education about forest planning. But now it is being thrown out along with the wildlife viability provision and enforceable limitations on logging and stream protection. I should say, by the way, that when the Forest Service says, oh, don't worry, we're not abandoning NEPA, we're complying with NEPA through a categorical exclusion, you should make sure you understand what a categorical exclusion is. It's basically a way of saying we don't need to do any NEPA analysis on this. So while they're not completely ignoring NEPA, they're just saying it doesn't apply. It's a distinction without much of a difference. There are a number of problems with this approach. The first is legal. The Forest Service bases its new theory of that national forest plans don't mean anything on the Supreme Court's decision in a case called Ohio Forestry Association versus Sierra Club, where the Supreme Court held that the logging provisions of a forest plan could not be challenged directly, but must await a site-specific logging project before judicial review could occur. But Ohio Forestry was a case about when a lawsuit alleging violations of NIFMA in a logging project could be heard. It was not a case that said forest plans don't make any decisions that require NEPA analysis. So the Forest Service has taken a little bit of a kernel out of that case and tried to grow it up into a huge overhaul of national forest management. Moreover, the court in Ohio Forestry explicitly limited its holding to the logging provisions of a forest plan. It did not decide that other provisions of a forest plan could not be challenged directly or did not make important decisions. And as any folks who've been involved in forest planning know, forest plans make a lot of decisions that don't have anything to do with logging. Among them are, for example, where motorized vehicles can and cannot be utilized for recreational purposes in the national forest, what areas will be recommended for wilderness. Forest Service officials have frequently used forest plans to make very important site-specific decisions with real consequences in forest plans on those kinds of issues. For example, in the Lolo National Forest, the 1986 Forest Plan established what was called Management Area 11, a non-motorized backcountry area in the Bitterroots and other parts of the forest. The forest plan itself closed these areas to motorized recreational use, and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld that closure against a challenge by a snowmobile association. The Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest Plan, an 1987 plan, established a management area A4 non-motorized roadless management area in the sapphires and tobacco roots, among other places. Again, the forest plan itself accomplished the closure. So now, if the Forest Service, in its new generation of forest plans, decides to open up some of those areas to motorized vehicle use, are they going to claim that that is not a decision that has on-the-ground impacts requiring environmental analysis? Is that an aspirational decision? Or what if the Forest Service decides to kick motorized vehicles out of an area they can currently use? Is that aspirational and strategic? I think we may see that these forest planning regulations, which in Washington, D.C. sounded good in terms of getting rid of NEPA, when the rubber hits the road at the local level, it may produce some problems. If the Forest Service tries to use plans in the way they have been in the past, it's going to run into a problem with this idea of getting out from under NEPA. Alternatively, if the Forest Service under the new regs simply decides to articulate a vision in the forest plan with respect to motorized recreation, and then has to go through a whole separate travel planning process to implement that vision, is that really streamlining? To have two planning processes necessary to make a decision that the agency was able to make in one planning process under the pre-existing legal regime. And that brings up another point. Would we even want forest plans that are as detached from on-the-ground management as the Forest Service seems to want to make this new generation of plans? One good thing about the forest plans of the last 20 years was that they could be a vehicle. They could serve as a vehicle for resolution of public disagreements over national forest use. If the Wilderness Association and the Snowmobile Association got together and hammered out an agreement over what areas would be motorized, what areas would be non-motorized, it could be embodied in a forest plan amendment. Both sides could count on it. If the Forest Service went back on it, both sides could enforce it. And that was a way to establish some certainty that both sides could count on in National Forest Administration. If this new generation of plans is not going to make any decisions about what is going to happen in any particular area of the forest, then that function can no longer be served by forest plans. Which brings up my final point. If the forest plans aren't going to prescribe anything, they're not going to bind the agency to do anything, and they aren't going to embody any standards that can be enforced if the Forest Service violates them, then why is the public going to take time out of their busy lives to invest effort in paying attention to, commenting on, getting involved in, going to meetings about this new planning process? I think what we'll probably like to see in reality is the action is going to shift to the site-specific project decision. And so instead of having one big fight over forest administration at the forest planning level, you're going to see increasingly a whole lot of little fights when the rubber actually hits the road on these more site-specific project decisions. And I think that's probably where we're headed under this new regime, assuming it survives legal review, which is, as I say, it's subjected to at this time. So thank you very much.
You're up next. Nope. Excuse me? Yeah. Our next speaker is Bob Wolf. Bob Wolf worked in sawmills and as a private forester in field positions with the U.S. Forest Service, field and policy positions with the U.S. Bureau of Land Management, the Bureau of the Budget, the Office of the Comptroller General of the U.S. He served on the professional staff of the Senate Committee of Interior and Insular Affairs, Public Works, and Committee on Labor and Welfare, and was Assistant Chief of the Natural Resources Division of the Congressional Research Service when he retired in 1984. Bob Wolf was intimately involved in enactment of the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act of 1960, the Wilderness Act of 1964, the Forest and Rangeland Renewable Resources Planning Act of 1974, the National Forest Management Act of 1976, and numerous other forest, resource, trade, and fiscal policy laws. He attended Columbia University, class of '42, and transferred to the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry. His education was interrupted by enlisting in the Army Air Corps just after Pearl Harbor, and he served for 4 years, 2 overseas, becoming a captain. I now introduce Bob Wolf.
I thought I was going to be the last one up. And in baseball, it's the end of the inning, and the bases are already loaded. You're supposed to hit cleanup, but Jack is going to do that. I did have something to do with the National Forest Management Act, and it was a great experience because it was a piece of legislation that passed the Senate on a bipartisan basis unanimously, and it passed the House of Representatives overwhelmingly. And when it came out of conference, it had unanimous support. And the differences, the few votes against it in the House were people who wanted more specifics in the law as to what the Forest Service could and couldn't do. And this was something that both Chairman Talmadge, Chairman Jackson, and Chairman Foley weren't going to do. They weren't going to write precise rules into the law. So I think I'd like to start out by pointing out that, but having worked on the National Forest Management Act after all these years, sometimes I feel like DeForest, who invented the vacuum tube, he was asked about his contribution to radio after 25 years, and he said, my child, what have they done to it? There's almost universal agreement of the need to overhaul the 1982 regulations. I think there's a real consensus on that. And there are valid observations that in their present form, the final regulations do serious and needless damage to the regulations that were solidly based on the NFMA. But let me suggest some fundamental shortcomings rather than going through or trying to go through all the details of the regulations themselves. The regulations fail to set into motion a strategy by the Forest Service to create an atlas for each forest that shows the ecologic and infrastructure that forest has. After a century of management, it's my view it's long past time for such a detailed piece of information to be available on each forest, and that's the way that you would avoid doing long, involved environmental analyses that turn out to be 8-pound books that are turgid and nobody can understand them anyway. I think the regulations missed another opportunity, and that is to make a model of how a forest plan should be. My view, having read an awful lot of plans, thought about it a lot, is that plans should have just 3 chapters. Chapter 1 describes the forest and its resources and its infrastructure. Chapter 2 describes where the forest has been the last 10 years, what they've done, and even a little longer back if somebody thinks that's essential. And the 3rd chapter describes where you want to go in the decade ahead. In the draft form, you wouldn't have more than 3 options. Any more than 3 options is nutty, at least in my view. And when it finally they've settled on an option, there's just one option in the final plan, and that's your plan, that's what you're going to do. And I think that would streamline the process effectively. The other thing I would observe is that I doubt that there's as many as 20 million acres in the national forest that are economically viable for timber sales. We started out back in 1980, we had 77 million acres that were in forest plans scheduled to be logged. Each of the plans as they came out reduced it, and it got down to 47,272,000 acres. There'll probably be even less in the future plans. But the cold hard fact is the national forests were never selected to be national forests based upon their economic potential. They were selected out of the public domain. Interior was glad to get rid of them. The General Land Office business was getting rid of land, and Gifford Pinchot and his associates were more than glad to take it off their hands. And so you had a system that, instead of being all forest, and the term implies that, there's less than 50 million acres that actually is viable under the current standards for timber production. And at the most, there was 77 million acres. And so we really have pretended that we were dealing with something that had a great economic vitality when it didn't have it. I want to say a word about diversity. While the law speaks to the diversity of tree species in the region, this did not exclude using the plant and animal species. It broadened charting diversity beyond a single national forest, which might have been assumed from the Senate language, land area. It permits using the region controlled by the unit plan. And this I see as one of the real challenges of the 21st century. And let me quote from E.O. Wilson in the John Chafee, he's a noted biologist, and a Senator John Chafee guest lecture in 2002, and he said, "Our relations with the rest of life can be put in a nutshell. Scientists have found the biosphere to be richer in diversity than ever before conceived, and that biodiversity, which took over 3 billion years to evolve, is being eroded at an accelerating rate by human activity." And I think this applies to where we ought to be going on the national forest. These lands should be examples of what is the right thing to do, not dedicated solely to trying to get out the cut. And I can speak to that because that used to be one of my objectives. I used to say I never saw a sail I couldn't make or a road I couldn't build. And I did a lot of that. But I'd like to close with some words from a former Secretary of Agriculture, Clinton Anderson of New Mexico, who became a senator from New Mexico. And he wrote this in 1964 in his philosophy of conservation. He said, "Conservation is to a democratic government by free men as the roots of trees are to its leaves. We must be willing to wisely nurture and use our resources if we're going to keep viable the inner strengths of our democracy. Whereas we have and hold dear our practices of conservation, we say to the other peoples of the world that ours is not an exploitive society, solely materialistic in outlook. I believe we have as our basic responsibility the preservation of the fertile mantle of soil of our nation. We must protect our water resources by controlling runoff and conserving its use. I believe we must carefully harvest our renewable resources so the amount we remove in any period balances the growth. The timber, the grass, and the wildlife are rich examples. I believe we must do more than just balance growth and harvest. We must replace what we take with a new crop that's of high quality and utilization to mankind." Then he defined wilderness, and this is 1964. He said, "I view wilderness as an anchor to windward. Knowing it is there, we can also know that we are still a rich nation, tending to our resources as we should, not a people in despair, searching every last nook and cranny of our land for a board of lumber, a barrel of oil, a blade of grass, or a tank of water. Our dedication to the cause of conservation is the highest cause to which we can dedicate our interest. In doing so, we dedicate ourselves to mankind's future and the full realization of our fondest hopes, not only for ourselves, but for our fellow man." Now, I worked for Clint Anderson, and I had a very high respect for him because my mother was also an Anderson, among other things. But because he was a solid, able conservationist, he believed in balancing use with management. And I think what he said in 1964 is as apt today as it was back then. And as I thought about what to say to y'all, I just went back and looked up what Clint said then and decided it would be a useful note to close on. And thank you very much.
Our final... What's that? Our final speaker tonight is Dr. Jack Ward Thomas. He holds a BS in Wildlife Biology from Texas A&M, an MS in Wildlife Science from West Virginia University, and an MF and PhD in Forestry from from the University of Massachusetts. He has been honored as a distinguished alumni by each of these institutions. He has worked 10 years for the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department as both a management and research biologist, and 30 years for the U.S. Forest Service, 27 years as a research scientist, and 3 years as chief. He is currently the Boone and Crockett Professor of Conservation at the University of Montana, where he has taught for 7 years. He has authored or co-authored over 400 publications spread across a number of specialty areas, including ecology, conservation biology, forestry, range management, threatened species management, ethics, philosophy, economics, fish and wildlife management, and natural resources planning. He has received numerous awards. I'd like to introduce Dr. Jack Ward-Thomas. Whoa, you're a hard one. There you go.
Thank you. Well, from that litany, you can tell that one of the things she didn't mention that I was either part of or led all 4 of the teams that dealt with the spotted owl old growth issues in the Pacific Northwest, and so I sort of feel like I've been there and done that. Well, finally, there's a new planning rule that somebody's is going to try to get through. That's long overdue. In fact, you can go back, I don't know how many times where somebody gets elected, the Forest Service struggles for 3.5 years to get a new planning rule ready to go. Election comes up, decide, well, we better delay this to after the election so it won't interfere with my re-election, and damn funny thing happened on the way to the forum. And so then the new administration starts again. I don't know how many times we've done this, but some revision in the planning regulations is long overdue. But the question we're talking about tonight is this one any better? And a long delay that we've been going through for I don't know how many years really doesn't speak well for the idea of adaptive management. We simply have been struggling for over 2 decades and haven't been able to adapt yet. But I'm not sure the Forest Service bears full responsibility for that. Now planning, there's a problem. Planning and implementation is deteriorated to a process that's slow, expensive, tedious, uncertain, and so expensive that almost any action will ultimately cost more than the resulting action is worth. And actions are relatively few and more difficult than many consider rational. And maybe that's some people's idea of success. The new rules provide more flexibility to line officers. Now that's good or bad depending on your viewpoint. The new rules rely heavily on environmental management systems. I spent at least 9 or 10 phone calls in the last week to various state agencies, private enterprise operations, and get them to tell me about environmental management systems. I asked 9 questions and got 11 answers. That's sort of goosey. It's not too clear what that means exactly. Just how it works is more theory than concrete process. The track record of Congress funding such things is not too hot. Now monitoring. There's a heavy reliance in this new plan on monitoring. The track record of the Forest Service in dealing with monitoring and OMB and congressional support for monitoring is not stellar. In fact, it's the first thing that drops off when the budget goes down. Species diversity. The current diversity clause is technically impossible and an ever-present Achilles heel, and that's why some people like it so well. And as a matter of who wrote the diversity clause, that was 2 of my buddies in the Forest Service who the first plan came in from the Wallowa Whitman, and they said, lynx, I think we may have some of those up in the Wallowas, and if we do, we'll take care of them up there. And this was a response to tell them not to do that. Those words of viability had a whole lot different meaning when that was done than they have come to mean today. Now, This new plan shifts to coarse filter with a fine filter lay-in for T&E species or those that are apt to be candidates. I personally do not consider that an irrational process. The plan is strategic. In other words, action takes place when somebody's going to do something on the ground, and basically you don't get 2 bites at the apple. And there's some rational thought to that. I would be perfectly willing, if I were king of the world, to turn around and say, okay, we'll do all of that heavy-duty stuff in the plan, and then when we do it on the ground, we won't do the EAs and EISs at that level. But continuous bites at that apple get to be awfully, awfully expensive. The new plans provide more flexibility. Now that's good or bad, depending on your view of the confidence that you have in the agency. Now, another very important thing here to understand. Plans propose. Plans propose today, plans will propose tomorrow, and the Forest Service is not going to be able to do a darn thing about it, except propose. The administration and the Congress will dispose as to what they want to ask for money to do and what Congress is willing to put forward. Now, one of the great fallacies in planning initially was the old idea of sort of like the movie, you build it and they will come, plan it and they will fund. Not necessarily so. That didn't work in the past, and it's unlikely to work in the future. And there is this ringing mantra of public participation. There is seemingly, however, less and less agreement in general in the public as to the purpose and focus of the National Forest. And we are not going to settle that through a planning process. Humming the mantra of collaboration and singing Kumbaya has not produced agreement. It likely won't. So that brings me to the idea of the Gordian knot. If you remember from mythology that the Gordian knot was a puzzle that was put together to identify the rightful ruler of Asia. And when some conqueror would show up, they would bring him the Gordian knot and see if he could pick it apart and see if he could be the rightful ruler of Asia. They brought it out to Alexander the Great. He looked at it for a moment, pulled out his sword and whacked it in half. Now, the management of the National Forest System is a Gordian knot. It's a tangle of laws that don't fit together very well. It's a mismatch of what does the public want of the lands that they own. And I don't think there's any planning rule that's going to sever that knot. Only the Congress can do that. And if you expect any plan to be able to do that, you are simply wrong, in my opinion. Congress has chosen not to clarify that issue. And, I got to be chief for 3 years, and some of the most entertaining moments of my life was appearing before congressional committees 1 a week and matching wits with 9 to 10 congressmen or senators at a time. I always thought that was about even. So basically, Congress cannot decide what those forests are for, and I don't know that we would be able to figure that out either through this process. Now, one of the things that we announced some time back, chief before me, is that we were going to do ecosystem management. And the idea behind that was we were going to plan at a larger scale. We were going to include more variables. And we were going to figure this out over a longer term. And all the laws lead you to that. But I think I didn't run into that word in this planning document at all. That's a very distinct no-no now. We don't use those words. We do the same thing, but we don't use those words. Now, clearly, some problems have been very clearly revealed to us. Was for example, spotted owls in the Northwest, which, by the way, was never an issue about spotted owls. It was an issue about cutting too much timber too fast, and particularly in older stands. But it was a good surrogate. It worked. We went through that, and we came to the conclusion that we kept telling our overseers that we had an ecosystem management problem. They kept sending us back to deal with spotted owls or fish or something, where we finally came to that conclusion. Then we tried to move, after we had the Northwest Forest Plan, we tried to move into the Columbia Basin, and by this time people got very nervous because all the little agencies they had deferred to one team leader, which was me. Marvelous choice. Now they were no longer willing to do that, so we had management by committee. And the whole operation began to look like a square dance without a collar. And it didn't work. However, they will not be able to ignore that landscape scale planning information when the plans start to come individually. Ultimately, they'll have to fit together one way or the other. But the problem was that we had problems that developed where the scale was so large it was bigger than the human scale. People couldn't relate to that. I mean, what do you mean I'm going to be involved in it? I want to know about right here, not this whole thing. And the laws fit together poorly to be able to deal with that. The Endangered Species Act and others force us to ecosystem scale, and the politics of the world force us to a much smaller scale where people understand what's going on. And the Forest Service planning rules can't fix that. So my conclusion in the end is finally somebody had the nerve to come forward with a new planning rule. Whether we can stand here, and that's what we're going to do in this meeting, is discuss that. But basically the planning rule in my mind does require revision. Whether or not this is exactly the right one, I don't know. But I do know, in my mind, it is time for revision. Thank you.
Okay, at this point, we're going to turn this off, and we're going to turn those mics on. That's your cue. Okay. If you have a question or a comment, please go over to the aisle, and we just ask that you keep your comment or question to the point and brief. Who would like to go first? Could you come to the microphone, please? We are filming this, by the way, for MCAT, Missoula Community Access Television.
Thank you, and thanks to all the speakers for very fine presentations. My question is directed to whomever wishes to answer, and it's fairly simple. Is planning obsolete? And let me frame this a bit for you. Jonathan Friedman, a theorist about planning, claims that planning is the professional practice of connecting knowledge to action. And that the models that we observe, the aspirational model, which may go the way of New Year's resolutions, or the prescriptive model, where you have standards that are perhaps too clumsy or inflexible, or any model that Congress doesn't fund, makes me wonder, why bother?
Who'd like to take that one up?
Let's start. I guess speaking as someone who represents a number of people who've devoted their careers to planning, maybe I should say a few words on that. It's easy to become cynical about plans because they may or may not be funded, they may or may not be consistent with the philosophies of varying political organizations, as we've mentioned earlier. But I guess I can't help but believe that it's valuable to bring all the knowledge we have about a piece of land together at one point, talk about that information with the public that cares, and come up with some idea about how it should be handled over the long term. Recognizing, once again, that it's going to be somewhat fluid, may not fulfill its entire potential, but I can't help but believe it's better to do that than not.
I think we have to plan, but it's just too inflexible at the moment. We all plan, but the planning frames and time frames that we've got involved in these things is just too long and it's too difficult to adjust. I think the planning would be fine if it was a bit more generalized and a heck of a lot more flexible in terms of being able to adjust quickly. For example, when you find I always thought one of the greatest failures was in our first round of planning, and we didn't seem to learn very fast. Quickly, we found out, for example, during that initial era when it was the get out the cut era, Forest Service would put in a plan and say, okay, in order to do this, we're going to have all this money for other things for mitigation. And Congress said, no, you asked for 100 units for timber, and we're going to give you 125. You asked for 50 units for roads, we're going to give you 75, and all that other stuff, later, baby. We'll wait till later. At some point, we should have just set our feet and said the plan has now gone off the track and is no longer working because it's not a complete plan. That's like, having a health plan that says, boy, I need a heart transplant and a kidney transplant, and they said, we're in for kidneys but no heart. After a little while, the system fails. And it did fail, and it failed very quickly, and there was a backlash, both externally and internally, to that type of operation. But we have to remember, a plan is only as good as its execution. And if the overseers, which is the administration through OMB, and the Congress through the budget do not deem it necessary to follow the complete plan, then we have to quickly admit that that plan is no longer functional, admit whatever plan is functional, and completely do our reassess where we're going very, very quickly and what the outcomes are apt to be.
I would add, one of the reasons I made the suggestions that I did was that I think that we really have to go back and examine what do we want to know, why do we want to know it, and how much do we need to know. And I had a chance to talk with Norm Johnson about this. I don't know how many of you know Norm, but he's the inventor of Forplan, among other things. And he agreed that this would be the way to go, but he said, I don't think the Forest Service is capable of doing it. Well, you can take that position, but my view is that if you pick 3 ranger districts in Region 1 and had them develop a model plan, you could find out, can you improve the process? And I'm for trying on a small scale to see what you need to do to reform things, not try to do it on the whole universe of every national forest. And I think that's the way you start to make some progress. Because I think that the planning process is broken. And I agree with Jack completely.
Okay, next question.
I also want to say thank you to all of you for all of your talks. It's been really interesting to me tonight. I really am fascinated by this whole topic and all the issues that it brings up. And it's kind of a little bit of follow-up to what Jim was saying. I think that the last Jack and Mr. Wolf just answered some of this question already. And I don't think I heard anybody specifically say this, but just as a clarifying question for tonight, is there anybody up there on the panel that believes that staying with the 1982 regulations would be the most ideal course we could take today? And maybe that's, it's a clarifying question, and maybe that's a silly question, but it'd be good to know what you all think about that.
Well, let me clarify your question. Are you saying to stick with 1982 versus the current reform, or just versus some?
Just as the most ideal course that could be taken, because I don't think I even heard you say that, Mr. Presso, that the 1982 regs would be the best way to go in the ideal world.
Just to be clear, if I wasn't clear, I don't think my organization or me or any of the groups we represent would say that the 1982 regulations were so wonderful they couldn't be subject to some useful reforms, but rather what the current lawsuit is saying, and what I think we are saying, is that this reform is throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Okay, next question, please.
Yeah, with regards to Dr. Ward, you were talking about indicator species and the spotted owl and the salmon and how that was guiding your planning process. The goal there, I think, being that if we can protect those indicator species, we protect all this other diversity, and we don't necessarily need to know everything about it. So that seems like a way you could save money and not need all the data. So I'd like to know what you think about indicator species. do you think it'll be like an important part of our future planning?
Well, let me clarify why I said what I said. The spotted owl forced the issue, given the fact that you have the Endangered Species Act. But the stated purpose of the Endangered Species Act is the preservation of ecosystems upon which threatened or endangered species depend. If you ever walked in old growth stands in the Pacific Northwest, and you walked around in there, and if you couldn't recognize that you were walking around in a relatively specialized ecosystem, you're a real dolt. And so it just, as the environmentalists said, that forced the issue of being sued. They said if the spotted owl had not existed, we would have had to invent it. The jig was simply up on the fragmentation and accelerated cutting of old growth forest. It hit the wall. But what forced it was the Endangered Species Act. I think it would probably have happened rather quickly anyway, just due to public backlash. I think indicator species are a potentially useful gimmick, but I think most biologists could identify the habitats that were in trouble more quickly than they could identify a species that was in trouble.
I would like to add to what Jack said. His point is the key one. Indicator species was a shorthand way of dealing with habitat. It wasn't the solution. It was one of the indicators. And it wasn't a perfect indicator. And I think that what we really were looking at was what sort of habitat do we need to maintain a variety of habitats, to have the kind of overall economic diversity, ecological diversity, that we should have in our public forest and public rangelands.
Well, just to, this is all too serious. Let's lighten this up a little. When I first arrived in La Grande, Oregon, worked for the Forest Service, the boss sent me over to the Oregon Co-op Wildlife Unit to kiss and make up. We'd been in a spitting match. And in those days we had year-end money, that is, money you had to spend it or lose it. So he figuratively gave me a little gym bag of money. And I called over there and to the unit leader and said, line me up about 4 kids with a master's, looking for master's funding, and I'll come over and see if I can fund one of them. So we did that. And after I got through, I guess they were all okay with me. And I looked at him and I said, well, I don't care, Howard, which one do you want? And he said, well, I'd like for Eric Forsman, he wants to look at the habitat relationships of the northern spotted owl. And I looked at him and I said, well, hell, Howard, I guess that's okay with me, but what's the bag limit on those damn things? Which kind of indicates to you how we've changed our attitude about what wildlife is and what counts. And so their $1,750 master's study tripped off a situation and not only ended up with a situation in the Northwest, but ended up with ecosystem management from a $7,500 study. And if I'd have known what the bag limit was, I could have headed it off.
I do want to say something about the indicator species, because for people who don't understand what that whole concept is, the 1982 National Forest Management Act regulations established this idea that the way you would carry out the wildlife viability guarantee was the Forest Service would designate certain species as indicators. They'd be the canaries in the coal mine. They'd be species that represented or had special needs with respect to a certain habitat type, and they were thought to represent a larger group of species that also depended on that habitat type. Rather than monitoring all those species, you'd pick this indicator, which presumably you'd pick because you could monitor it, and you'd monitor the trends of that indicator, and you'd know whether you were driving this particular species that depended on this habitat type down the tubes. Well, the problem was that this was an idea that I think had some merit, but it was never, the agency never put any resources into it, and to be fair, Congress probably didn't give them a lot of money to put the resources into it. But at the same time, they were ratcheting up the logging. So you're out there impacting the habitat, but you're not implementing the yardstick you've provided for yourself to determine what are you doing to the wildlife species that depend on that habitat. So that's why the indicator species issue emerged as a significant legal issue for the agency. It was impacting the habitat, but it wasn't following its own measures. It's not something anybody forced down their throat. They came up with this whole idea to make sure that what they were doing wasn't pushing wildlife past the point of viability. Most of the litigation that's arisen under the viability regulation has been about the failure to carry out their own self-imposed duties to monitor indicator species. To my knowledge, there's only been one substantive viability challenge that really had any legs, which was the spotted owl issue. Other than that, the whole concept, the Forest Service is saying, oh, we can't deal with viability, we can't save all these species, we don't even know what we have. How can we ensure that we have all these species? Well, they've never really been sued, except in the spotted owl context, for failing to actually maintain the viable populations. What they've been sued for was not to follow their own measuring device at the same time they're out there impacting the habitat. And that's how we got to where we are in the indicator species.
One of the things I think that we overlook is that we don't look back at history to see what really happened. If you take the first roughly 50 years of the National Forest, they cut less than 1 billion feet a year, most of it in large long-term contracts. All the arguments the Forest Service had was over grazing, trying to get some regulation of grazing. And whenever they had any suits, it was always by the timber industry over the terms of renegotiation of long-term contracts. But we weren't paying much attention to biodiversity, ecological significance, all these other things. This didn't come up until fairly recently in the scheme of things. So you had all that period when the national forests were really not being intensively managed or intensively manipulated, and nobody thought there was a problem at all. There may have been problems, but nobody thought of them. Now we're embroiled in a big debate over whether we should raise the cut again.
Okay, next question, please.
First of all, thank you to the Boley Center for organizing what is a very important discussion. Mr. Presso suggested that public involvement may be compromised, or there may be no incentive for public involvement in forest planning, the forest planning process, particularly if categorical exclusions apply. My question is for all the panelists. What are the incentives and what are the challenges to trying to increase public involvement in forest planning if these new regulations do go through?
Well, I'll start with that. The regulations themselves emphasize public involvement to a degree that earlier regulations have not. And that's an incentive on its own for those of us who take the regulations seriously. The emphasis in the rule is with a collaborative approach to developing the plan and evaluating the resources in the planning area and in long-term monitoring and developing the design and actual monitoring of the long-term management of the unit in question. So I think that's one reason that there's an incentive. Another is that with the focus on strategic planning, the emphasis on having a collective vision of where management of the unit should be going is even more important than it was under a more tactical approach, because it's focusing on that vision and not so much on the nuts and bolts of how to get there.
Okay, next question, please.
I don't have a memorized speech, but I know this is in the Arnold Boley spirit. I knew Arnold Boley. He was my advisor in graduate school. I really think he'd approve of this new planning approach. And I hear talk about the collaborative approach and how this is going to hinge on public involvement. I've been involved with a forest management plan revision here recently with public involvement in our group up at Plains. And it's pretty darn hard to keep people coming back to the table week or month after month. And, they just drop out and they just, I think it's pie in the sky to think that they're going to stay right in there and try and help build a plan. I think it's important that the Forest Service try to get that input, and remembering that it is the forest manager, the resource manager, whatever they're called there in the description, that he maintains the authority over how things are done. All the public input is important, for the public, for the manager to understand what people want and where they're going. But in a couple places in the description of the new plan, they talk about an objectionist will meet with the forest resource manager and collaborate and come to an agreement. Well, then later on in there, they say, no, that isn't quite the case. The Forest Service still has that authority to do it, to make the decision. I really think that this approach is better than we've had. I worked on the IPNF under the old plan, actually the 76 plan, and I thought it was okay. But I really think this is a better approach, to leave it open and not be as so restrictive in what's coming out of it. Be more flexible. I think it's a good idea.
I'll just speak to those last two comments. I certainly agree that public participation is an important part of forest management. And again, I think this fits into this core principle of discretion, because I believe if you look at some of the regulatory language carefully, there is enough room there for some very progressive and innovative Forest Service leadership to do wonders with that language, whether it's to breathe life into citizen advisory boards, citizen-based monitoring projects, different types of ambitious and more inclusive scoping at the plan, certainly at the project level. And I think some people will take advantage of that language, and we'll see what good public participation might look like. But I also think there's enough discretionary language in those regulations that we're going to see the bare minimum of public participation by some supervisors and others that don't embrace your support for public participation. And then we're going to have basically a bare minimum sort of rulemaking baseline of public participation. And of course the regulations, like all of the regulations before them, fail to address what's the point of public participation in forest management. How is public participation supposed to be balanced with other statutory obligations that our Forest Service officials are obligated to implement? And so they don't say necessarily. And it doesn't say what types of public participation. So is public comment that is, to some national level rule, is that public participation more important than some sort of more watershed-based, collaborative, deliberative approach to public participation? We don't know. So I think we're going to be wrestling with these issues for a while.
Well, I would add that while the speaker may think he knows what Arnold Boley would have done, Arnold's dead. And unless he has some extra communicative device, I don't think he can figure out where Dean Boley would have gone. But I do remember when the Boley report came out, you would have thought that group that had done that report had committed original sin. So they didn't get a lot of applause from a big sector of the society out here. But you're entitled to your opinion that the new regulations are an improvement. You may be right, I don't know.
Can I just say about public involvement, I think, to my mind, what's troubling about the new rule is that there are obviously provisions in the new rule that call for public involvement at certain stages, but it's a little bit of public involvement in a vacuum, because the process we're all used to, you would have a draft forest plan that would have a number of alternatives. It would look at those alternatives, it would say, okay, under this alternative we're thinking about X level of logging and road building, that equals Y levels of elk or pileated woodpeckers or water quality, and you would be able to look at that as a member of the public and say, well, gee, I don't really like that one, I like this one better. Now you're not going to have that impacts analysis. That's the NEPA process. That's what they've decided they don't want to do in connection with planning anymore. So while you're going to have public involvement, you're not going to have the same kind of informational basis upon which to base your public involvement as you've had in the past. And I think that, to me, is what's troubling about this new regime in terms of public involvement.
I would just add that that the lack of an environmental impact statement doesn't entirely preclude the evaluation of options for managing the national forest. We anticipate that this process will, in fact, evaluate a variety of options. The detail with which those effects or trends associated with those options might be described would be different from what we're used to, but this isn't something that's going to go away under the new rule.
And that's what I was going to say, what Pam just said. And I also think with public involvement in the past planning process, when it takes 10 years or longer to revise a plan, of course people drop out of it because people just move or they come into an area and they just don't have that level of commitment to the process. But hopefully if this takes 2 to 3 years to revise a plan, that people will stay engaged more. And also at project level planning that we're talking about, I'm involved in a lot of project level planning, and it is where people stay engaged because they can see some rather quick outcomes to their involvement. So I'm hopeful that it will be better.
I am quite impressed with the fact that you have addressed the need for streamlining the planning process, trying to get it down from the 15-20 period that's longer than the time that is implemented once it's after the planning is done. I think that's a step in the right direction. I do feel a need, though, for something else that I have not heard yet, and that is emergency planning, stopgap planning. And I think that what we are faced with now in our Forest Service and in our forests is a very definite need for fast action. And as an example, if you have an accident case coming into an emergency room, you don't bring in all of the consultants and all the staff to analyze whether you should amputate or could you save the leg. And I think that we're faced with a situation, I've seen it year after year now, and this year is critical. We are just sitting here waiting for the next fire season. We've had no moisture, no rain. We have beetle-infested, diseased, overgrown forests that have developed this over long, tedious planning processes of the past years since 1987. This is where we are now. We're in an emergency situation. And is there any way that you can see to develop into your planning stages right now something that could be followed immediately? Right now, we're sitting here with our governor trying to locate enough equipment for the next fire season, which is upon us, while we're decommissioning roads, demolishing roads. I don't know how that equipment's going to get there, but I think that maybe in the planning process there is another type of planning. Is there any suggestions or any answers, or has this been addressed? Could you tell me, please?
Well, I would say that the long-term planning that we're talking about tonight isn't particularly designed to deal with emergencies, except to the degree that it helps us to describe conditions, such as the ones you talk about, that set the stage for the need for action on a project-by-project basis. But the response to the urgent need for that type of activity is basically handled at the project level.
And that is what we're doing now throughout the forests of the United States. That is the type of implementation that we're doing. Just sitting here waiting. I don't see the Healthy Forest Bill was passed. I don't see that much activity out there in the thinning process and the cleaning out of the forests and so forth. I see it on the private land. I see it in the state land. I do not see it in the national forests. We're just sitting and waiting for the next fire season. And I think that there is something that is, if you don't have that kind of planning going on right now, what you can do for emergencies, I think it's a new type of planning that I think we need to possibly look at prioritizing, and I think the emergency is the priority. If we're about to lose our forests, all this planning will be for naught if they're nothing but sticks.
I think that the response I made earlier is the only one I have available, and that is that there are a number of projects being designed to address those issues around the region, but it's a fairly large-scale issue and difficult to handle quickly.
I'm going to make a statement. I'm going to look at somebody and see if they nod. I believe that they're moving as fast as they're ahead of their targets in terms of the Healthy Forest Initiative, or the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, that the targets projected under that act, they're ahead of those schedules. So I don't think planning's slowing them down. It's their implementation's ahead of schedule on their plans. Is that right? That's right, okay.
Well, I think if you have as bad a fire season, as some people are afraid you're going to have, 2/3 of what burns is going to be rangeland. About 1/3 is going to be forest land. We tend to think of it always as being forest. We always think of it as being hard burn, but it isn't always hard burn. But the rangeland that gets burned is land that's been burned year after year during decades. And it's the land that, in my view, is in the worst shape. And the amount of forest land that gets burned, except for these big explosive fires that we've had that hit specific forests, have been relatively minor in terms of their overall impact. What's happened is when you had a big fire that blew up and got away, that gets all the attention. That's what gets on national TV. But I think you need to take a hard look at what is burned. I'm not saying you're going to have an easy fire year by any means. I think it's likely to be a very tough one.
I would just say that in terms of what the law provides on this score, we've talked a lot about this cumbersome planning process and how it needs to be reformed, et cetera. One thing to bear in mind is under the NIFMA itself, what's called a non-significant plan amendment, which a lot of these sort of project level, if a plan's prescriptions are getting in the way of a project level decision, a lot of times it can be done through a non-significant amendment. Those can be done with any process whatsoever. Basically, it's up to the Forest Service to decide how much process they want to apply in that kind of situation. So that NIFMA contemplates that there will be they need to make some kind of project level plan amendments, and that if they're not so sweeping in their effect as to be deemed significant, they can be done very expeditiously.
This comment or question is directed to Mr. Presso. You seem to relish your role as adversary of the Forest Service. Is there a more productive role that you see that Earthjustice could play in helping formulate policies rather than protracted and costly legal battles over the minefields that our Forest Service process seems to give you opportunities, at least in the legal framework, to challenge activities that are going on? Do you see a more productive role or a way that the Earthjustice could interact with the Forest Service in a way that we might end up with something that was acceptable?
Well, I think we're doing that. In addition to having a law firm practice, we also have a legislative policy shop that helps develop policy proposals and advise individuals and conservation organizations on policy decisions, and makes policy proposals to the executive branch and to Congress. So we do have more than just a litigation role. But I would say about that, I'm not about to apologize for it, and I don't think it's anything that should be apologized for. First of all, when it comes to these kinds of major land management decisions, the Forest Service is armed with the Department of Justice, which is the world's biggest law firm. The industry is armed with some of the best private firms that money can buy. The members of the public, conservationists, Native American tribes, ranchers, landowners who live adjacent to the national forests, they don't have ready access to that kind of legal representation. They don't have typically the dollars to invest to get Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher or Covington and Burley to appear for them in federal court. That's where we come in. We don't charge a dime to our clients for our legal services. They don't pay a penny for our hourly rates. But we provide very high quality representation to them to make sure that the playing field is even when these legal disputes arise. Now, is it appropriate to have a legal check? Well, let's put it this way. If we didn't have the opportunity to have judicial review of Forest Service land management decisions, we would never have had the reform of the old growth logging, at least not as timely a reform of the old growth logging that was occurring in the Pacific Northwest. We would not have had the resolution of the issue that was going to develop a huge gold mine at the northeastern boundary of Yellowstone National Park. We would not have had reform of oil and gas practices that were threatening to develop large parts of the southern end of the Yellowstone ecosystem. So we've achieved a lot that I think is one of those things. It's today's controversial headline. From a historical perspective, it's one of our country's most proudest conservation achievements. So, sometimes it's important to take a stand. It may be a controversial stand, but I believe history will prove us out.
I had a friend owned a lumber company in Northern California in the 50s, and I asked him, why do you file a suit against the Forest Service every winter? He said, well, there's nothing else to do. He had a law firm on a retainer, and he thought that was great sport. Yeah.
Let me make a comment, and this is going to shock a lot of people. But when I was chief of the Forest Service, I'd bring my people in and I'd say, look, I'm telling you, we're going to tell the truth, we're going to obey the law. And they said, well, we keep getting sued. I said, yeah, but we keep losing. By definition, when you get sued and lose, by the rules, you're wrong. And getting sued 9 times on the same thing and losing 9 times is just damn dumb. Now, I may not have agreed with the judge, but by definition, we were in violation of the law. And until Congress then decides to change it, we have to come into compliance. So, I didn't like it. I always hated to get sued and lose. But when you get sued and lose, you got to go look in the mirror and say, by the rules, we were wrong. And that's the way it is. That's the system. Anything else is nothing but chaos.
Well, let me add that in '72, when the suit was filed in West Virginia, I thought the plaintiffs were nuts. And I was talking to Dick McArdle, a former chief of the Forest Service, who was a longtime friend, and I said, Mac, why the heck are these people suing over the 1897 Act? They can't win. And he said to me, Bob, when I was chief, I had an opinion from Fred Minot, my counsel, who said we're violating the 1897 Act. We're cutting timber that we have it after, when we sell it, before we marked it. And we're cutting trees that are not dead and mature. He said, they're going to lose the suit. And when I told that to the council in the Department of Agriculture, he said, well, Mac's getting senile. Now, McArdle was right.
Old chiefs never get senile.
Old chiefs are always right.
I'm sorry, I need to respond to that because, for one thing, the timber industry in Montana rarely files a lawsuit, and I can't remember one in the last 15 years. I mean, we may file as a friend of the court or something, but we don't initiate a lawsuit. And I think what Dave's comment or question was is there a more productive role for those who do file lawsuits to come to the table and talk to us, since it seems to be so hung up on logging, and talk to us about these project-level decisions and project-level proposals instead of just going to court all the time. And I appreciate that question because it's really important to us. It's important to communities, and it's important to be able to get in there and do the work that needs to be done to talk about it up front instead of arguing about it in court. So, and also, with all due respect, you may not charge your client a fee, but if you are winning in court, the federal government is paying your fee, and that's everybody out there who pays taxes is paying your legal costs.
Well, I guess what I would say to that is it's interesting, it sort of all depends on whose ox is being gored. The industry did not hesitate to sue to try to overturn the roadless area conservation rule, did not hesitate to sue to try to overturn the 2000 Clinton administration forest planning regulation reform. And so it is one of those things when the industry doesn't like the decision, they've not hesitated to go to court. And I have never seen them turn down an attorney's fee award either. It's been interesting there. What I would say about that is that the law provides that parties who prevail in a lawsuit against the United States can get an award of a reasonable attorney's fee. That's the Equal Access to Justice Act. And so by definition, in order to achieve a fee award, you have to prevail, not only prevail, but establish that the government's position was not substantially justified. So there's a high burden. We have on several occasions, obtained a fee. It is certainly not the reason that I have left private law firm practice and taken a 60% pay cut to join Earth Justice. It wasn't for the hope, gleam in the eye of getting an Equal Access to Justice Act fee award. So it represents a very small portion of our budget, most of which is funded through individual private contributions. So it's not about money. And I do think that one thing you have to bear in mind is that when you know, it's one thing to say, well, we should all collaborate, we should get along, you know, we should have this upfront discussion. Well, what do you do when you go to the upfront discussion and nobody listens to you? And the decision comes out and it's going to be a disaster on the end. At that point, you just shrug it off and say, well, you know, whatever. I at least had my chance to go in and talk to somebody. No. Most people don't feel that that's appropriate, especially when you're talking about, in many cases, resources that are extraordinarily valuable ecologically. And so, yes, there are times when we have not hesitated to sue, but the industry has certainly, I've never seen it be too slow to pull the trigger when something was going through that they didn't like.
Can I respond again? Okay.
This is about public debate.
Again, and I don't want to argue about this, but again, you're skirting the question about what you can do. Again, the industry in Montana does not sue. Rarely have we ever filed, even as a friend of the court. So maybe a timber industry in Oregon or something has filed suit on the things that you mentioned, but it's counterproductive to getting anything done in Montana to constantly be battling in court. I've never seen you at a meeting. I've never seen you come to a meeting to discuss some of these project level decisions. I'd love for you to come and talk about this stuff and find out who we are as a community instead of battling this in court. And again, I appreciate Dave's comment and his question because I think it's really key to the whole reason that the planning is changing to begin with.
I don't think it's productive to prolong this debate, except I would say that I'm quite confident that many members of the Montana timber industry are members of the American Forest and Paper Association, which was leading the charge to overturn the Roadless Area Conservation Rule in the federal courts. So it may not be that your particular association has filed litigation, but I assure you that your members have. Or at least through their representatives.
Next question. Yes, please.
Well, I want to thank Martin and Chief Thomas for raising the issue of who you're going to trust in this, because quite frankly, my trust in the agencies and Congress, environmentalist lawyers, and the Ninth Circuit Court is all in the toilet. And I guess, why don't you guys expand on the issue of trust, and basically, for someone like me, who should I trust? That's one question. The second thing, you know, Tim brought up a real good point about, you know, this rule might change it so that the big battles that have been fought way up there at 30,000 feet, like Ice Bump was, they've been changed to small battles. And I guess what I want to ask you guys is, do you see that as a good thing or a bad thing? Thank you.
Well, I guess that on the one hand, battles are not my favorite metaphor for working with the public, but the issues have been raised at both the plan level and the project level for as long as I've been in the Forest Service, so I don't think there's a question of exchanging one for the other, but perhaps focusing on the issues that are most relevant to the decision to be made, and that decision, we think, is most relevant when a project is proposed. That's when many people get involved. They feel they can evaluate the impact of this idea, of this proposal on their values, and they know the area and can be meaningfully engaged. And so I guess I think that there is reason to focus on that step in the process.
Don't trust me.
Well, I think the big difference may be when you lose on a big issue, it's pretty clear what the precedent is. I'm not sure if you lose on a little issue, you're going to see the precedent as clearly. In other words, so the court, you lose on a big issue, the court clears the deck, you understand you lost and you're dumb to do it again. when you get down to a site-specific decision, I'm not so sure the precedent's going to be clear.
Well, I'm not a lawyer, but I've never seen a litigant who lost, who said, "My God, I'm wrong." I've never seen a criminal who's been convicted who said, "Gee whiz, I did commit the crime." You know, we're not all good losers. Damn few of us are. And I'm not a good loser either.
Well, I'm going to dispute that. Because going back to what I said before, one of the hardest things I had to get across was we don't want to keep losing on the same issue. Once we have a clear decision from the court, we should learn from that. Even if we don't agree with it, it doesn't matter. If we don't agree, we appeal, and if we lose the appeal, that's that. Don't do it again.
Yeah, I would say, seriously, that, I mean, if you stand back and look at it politically from an institutional standpoint, our system of checks and balances and separations of powers, our system of Republican form of democracy is built on mistrust. And the Forest Service is but one part of that larger process. I think we see that in all sorts of decisions. And, you know, in policy, there's often an inverse relationship between potential effectiveness and political feasibility, meaning that we could do all sorts of really interesting, you know, institutional reform, but it ain't going to happen in my lifetime, but it could have, you know, wonderful results. With regards to trust, just think about these responsible officials making promises or particular decisions to multiple use constituencies when they don't have really the power to be making some of those decisions. Now, maybe they will. This is all, I think, right now very gray, but if history provides any clue, a lot of decisions will continue to be made by higher level responsible officials. And as I said, this latest batch of regulations, it explicitly allows for higher level decision makers like the Undersecretary of Agriculture to intervene and make some of these very political and high profile decisions. Certainly President Clinton's Undersecretary of Agriculture brought it to an art form, Jim Lyons. Some people argue that Mark Ray is doing it. Lots of undersecretaries have done it, and they'll continue to do it. And it's also interesting because the forest products industry and a number of other stakeholders complained about that sort of political meddling from Washington, D.C., but at the same time retained their right to intervene and basically veto lower-level decision-making. And I think that's okay. These are national forests, but that is not necessarily the way to build trust. When the public is participating in some of this decision-making, and you never know, some of these decisions are going to be made at higher levels. And then, of course, something that the chief has talked about for years is that you can make promises to multiple use constituencies, but there's no guarantee that any of those plans or projects or monitoring or anything else are ever going to get funded. And that is certainly not the way to win trust between the agency and some of these constituents. So the whole system, and again, getting back to the use of litigation as a tool for conservation and other things, you know, our laws are designed for litigation. I mean, when architects of some of these laws sit down and write NEPA and the Endangered Species Act and NIFMA and everything else, they use very specific language and legal hooks that they know are going to trigger litigation, assuming that it is the only way, that's the only tool that gets agencies to act. And it's not just in natural resource policy, it's in all areas of public policy. So I think, I mean, you're really hitting a key issue here is that the big one of trust. And like I said, but don't trust me.
I think the thing to be clarified there that Martin said it, but maybe it requires a little bit more explanation. The development under the Clinton administration that's been followed hard by the people in her office now, our joke was called sue and settle. You set a suit up in front of the right judge, and then you go in and you don't defend, and you lose. Now all of a sudden you've got, if you think the Department of Justice is the Forest Service's lawyer, you're doing some really good stuff. They have their own agendas, and they follow them out, and they're just as political as hell. If you think it's justice in the morning, you're kidding yourself. They're just as much a part of the political arm of the government in power as you can possibly imagine. And I'm afraid the administration I work for started it, and this one understands it perfectly well. And what's good for the goose gets to be good for the gander, and I'm not sure this is a process that I think is really a good one.
Well, let me point out it's long been forgotten. In 1974, the Senate Ag Committee added language to the Resource Planning Act that said the Forest Service, in effect, could cut any timber that it wanted to if it was done in an environmentally sound way. The industry, which had a friend of the court, amicus brief in the West Virginia case, and the Forest Service came up and asked Senator Talmadge to take the language out because they were going to win the suit. Talmadge said, and I was in the meeting, said, "If you want it out, I'll take it out. It doesn't matter to me." 2 weeks later, Judge Maxwell issued his decision. Back came the industry to see Talmadge, and it was 8 o'clock one morning. I remember it very well. They were, put the language back in. Talmadge, who had that good Georgia drawl, said, "You want to be in court, you stay in court. You go to the Court of Appeals." So, but that whole, the 76 Act could have been avoided if that language had stayed in the 74 Act, at least in my view, because there wouldn't have been all the push to change it.
When people ask, why do you sue so much, I ask why the agencies break the law so much. But to get back to the question about the localized, or the site-specific decisions versus the plan-level decisions, what's more useful, I think one thing you're going to see is that it's kind of the whack-a-mole concept that Professor Nye mentioned, which is, if you're not going to do NEPA that looks at the whole forest at the forest planning stage, and when you get to that site-specific project, there's going to be an increased pressure to take a bigger look than the agency is accustomed to when it goes down to that project level. Typically, the agency does this big EIS at the plan level, and then when it gets to the project level, it says, well, we already took the big look. We know we're not going to be subject to the, quote, tyranny of small decisions because we looked at the big picture, we see how it's all going to play out. So now we can do this, and we'll just focus really on this particular area. They're not doing the big look anymore at the planning stage. So now when they get to the project level, there's going to be an increased pressure to do the bigger look at the project level. So I'm not sure this is really going to save the agency much in the way of NEPA resources. In fact, they may be eliminating some efficiencies by not doing the big look, one big shot at the planning stage, and then being able to rely on it when it gets down to the small scale decisions.
Okay, I have does anybody else want to?
Go ahead.
Comment? Okay. I have two questions. One is about the role of lobbying. I know it kind of came into my mind during the ping pong back and forth of whether or not the logging industry sued or was a friend of the court or whatever it was. But the role of lobbying as an alternative to a suit, it seems to me something that we all should consider or keep in mind. But if you could comment on that, I'd appreciate it. The other thing is about the acts like the Healthy Forest Restoration Act and the categorical exclusions that apply to logging or harvesting. And if we start to have a series of these type of CADEX activities, and where is the public going to really, or the Forest Service, have the obligation to do a thorough analysis that is reviewed by the public?
I'll answer your second question first. CADXs, we would not support a series of CADXs across the landscape because that's not how you do active management. CADXs have their place and they're a tool and they're an important tool, but it's not that we would just blanket put out 15 CADXs in one watershed. I mean, that's just not how you do it, so I'd never support that. In answer to your first question, certainly we lobby, certainly we call people back in Washington, D.C., as all interest groups do. It's not just the timber industry. Environmentalists have their folks in Congress that they talk to, and same with any industry out there. If you have concerns about what's going on, and you call who you know, and yes, we do.
I guess I'd like to go back to the question that preceded this one, which is related to the one that you asked, and that is, when do we take the big look? It will only play out with time, but the provision in the new planning regulations for a comprehensive evaluation report is one that I think is going to be very, very important to us all, because the objective of such a report is to have that big look at the resources, the disturbance regimes, the conditions and trends on the larger scale, and to be able to bring that information to the table when making project-specific decisions. So I guess only with time will we be able to show what that means, but that is the intent. Rather than doing a comprehensive environmental impact statement that evaluates detailed effects for speculative alternatives over a long period of time, we're looking more at a condition and trend evaluation and keeping that current by reviewing it and reevaluating it every 5 years.
How about if we look at the next question? You're getting the test of participation, not only staying this long, but having to stand. So I want to allow the next person to have a question.
Thanks. My question earlier was a clarifying question, so I don't count that one. I wanted to say the other night I was having a hard time falling asleep, so I grabbed a copy of the Earth Justice lawsuit on the new rules and decided to pick it up and start reading it, and help you fall asleep. I'm just kidding, but...
I didn't write that.
Yeah, I was going to say how well it was written. I was going to, but it is along those lines. I remember one of the claims in the case was a claim about, and I know you're probably restricted in how much you can talk about this. I'll try to keep this a question that possibly you can answer, Mr. Presso. And also, Martin, be ready, because it's coming to you too. One of the claims in the lawsuit was that, one of the APA claims was that the current rules were so significantly different from the prior rule that there's a need for an additional comment period under the APA rulemaking procedures. And what that led me to start thinking about was, well, what would that, I guess, without going into any more detail about that or the merits of that claim or anything, because I know you can't talk about that. What, in your mind, Mr. Presso or Martin, since you two have kind of been the most vociferous in your critique of the new rules and the most specific in your critique, what would you envision as being the process? Earlier on, Mr. Presso, you said we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. How do we do that? You know, if this isn't right, and Pam's probably cringing because she said we spent years doing all this stuff, but if this isn't the right way, what would you two, perhaps, and anybody else really wants to respond to, how would you envision what that process would look like to not throw out the baby with the bathwater?
Well, first, as to the APA process claim, I don't have a problem talking about that. And just to say that, the whole idea of this rulemaking process is you'll put out a proposal to the public to comment on, and then you will have a final rule that is a natural outgrowth of the proposal and the public comments. It's not that you'll put out a proposal and then in the interim you'll sort of rethink your whole program and come out with a whole different regime in the final, and that's essentially what happened here. So that's the nature of that claim, and it goes to is the fundamental aspect of public participation in the agency's processes so that you don't get a bait and switch as a member of the public when you're participating in this kind of process. As to what I think is the proper rule, I guess to my mind the agency should have stayed a lot closer to a reform of the 82 rule. I think there were a lot of important things in the 82 rule that provided important guarantees to the public. The concept of wildlife viability being central to those. I think a lot of Americans think about when they think of the national forest is a last refuge for a lot of wildlife species that don't exist elsewhere. And in fact, that's true. The national forests are a last refuge for a whole host of species that, but for the national forest, would no longer exist in our country. And so I think there were important things to protect, there were important provisions to protect wildlife in those rules. They should not have been discarded. Perhaps they should have been reformed. As to the process, I agree that a planning process that takes 10 to 15 years is absurd when the life of the plan is supposed to be 10 to 15 years. However, I think that's taking a very extreme example. Certainly not all planning processes have taken that long. And I do believe that the agency certainly should have been looking at ways to streamline that process, and it may be that things such as the timber provisions of the plan could be treated in a more cursory fashion with more site-specific detail down the road.
but the agency didn't choose to go the route of a reform. It chose to go the route of a complete overhaul and rewrite, and I think that's where we part company.
And I don't know about a vociferous critique. I thought I was being fair and balanced. But then I realized that term had been copyrighted by Rupert Murdoch, and I didn't want to get Professor Belsky at the Boley Center in any trouble. I mean, if I could really answer that question, I would be having boat drink someplace and not sitting up here. One, let me just, this is a way that I can also try to answer the first question with regards to planning. What's the purpose of planning? I do, it's interesting, and I go back and forth on this issue. I guess from a political science standpoint and from a public citizen standpoint, I do believe that we can't plan our way out of these sorts of fundamental forest conflicts. I believe that if you look at the history, the Forest Service has clung to this sort of planning-based paradigm, and it's a natural progression from their sort of, this progressive era scientific management and this strict sort of separation of politics versus science. All of those ideas have long been discredited, and I think anyone that has participated in the planning process knows that these are fundamentally political documents, and any decision that's important will be a political decision. So I don't think that planning I think that planning has done a lot of good, and I'm certainly not willing to get rid of it by any means, but I don't think planning was really a great way to deal with the conflicts that were in the Bitterroot in the early 70s or in the Monongahela in the 1970s. Those issues were about clear cutting, they were about how to manage particular landscapes and watersheds, and those things go to DC, and what do we get out? We get planning documents out of that process. So I still am critical of, and I guess I sound very similar to the policy professor that I'm replacing, Dick Behan, who was on the Boley Committee, that continues to say those same things. But to be a little problem-oriented, I think I can rip off a lot of other people's ideas of what I would do is, one, to try to untangle this Gordian knot that Chief Thomas talks about. I would seriously investigate the possibility of another Public Lands Law Review Commission that would survey the full canon of environmental laws, court orders, regulations, and other things, and try to figure out what's going on and create efficiencies that way. This is the longest period of time we have not had such a commission, and I think it would provide a lot of helpful guidance. I would also embark on a period of systemic experimentation on the public lands, like that's going on in New Mexico with the Valle Calderas, for example. I would also, this would be a good example of there have been all sorts of very reasonable people that have been complaining about NEPA for a long time. This sort of pre-decision based NEPA model where you just make these sorts of predictions into the future and you don't even try to follow up and find out what's going on. You just put all of your eggs in this prediction basket and then just walk away. A lot of people on the left and right and different stakeholders have long critiqued NEPA. So let's try to figure out a way to experiment and reinvigorate the whole purpose of NEPA, by the way, which is environmental protection. That's one reason why this whole critique of planning without purpose aggravates some people, because NEPA does have a very clear intent and purpose. So I would instead of running forward and trying to figure out what the hell environmental management systems is all about and what the hell this means and that means, I would actually try to do some of these experiments on very isolated public land units and see what we have learned, what worked and what didn't work, and if it worked well, expand it. And then I would also do some incremental reforms as well. So kind of a three-pronged approach that a lot of people here on campus and elsewhere have advocated before me.
Thank you both. That was great. Thank you.
This is a two-part question for Timothy Presso and then Pam Gardner, if you're able to respond. First to Pam Gardner, well, actually second to you, but I wanted to say I really appreciate the way you raised the issues at the beginning and then respond to the ones that have been going on there. So Timothy, I was wondering if you could just simply summarize briefly the legal grounds that are at stake in the Earth Justice lawsuit here, so I get a better sense about what are the grounds for challenging the rule there fairly quickly. And then, Pam, if you're able to respond to any of those simply from having been part of the inside process on that, from your perspective about that, not asking you to speak as a lawyer by any means, but just from your experience on that.
Well, I'm happy to summarize the law, the litigation. Basically, the focus of the litigation is really on both the substance and the process of this reform. As to the substance, I think you can probably pretty well tell from my earlier remarks, the concern with the substance is the abandonment of any enforceable standards, including those that Congress specifically called for. As I said, Congress meant, through the NIFMA, meant the forest plans to mean something in terms of imposing some standards, some obligations on the agency, some restrictions on logging in particular. The new rules jettison those limitations. And we don't think that's what Congress had in mind when it passed the NIFMA. Congress was trying to constrain an agency's discretion, not provide it new and greater discretion, and that's what these rules accomplish. As to the process goes to the point I think I raised in terms of answering the other gentleman's question, which was the kind of the bait and switch or the blindsiding that occurred with publication of the final rule. For example, the EMS, Environmental Management System concept, emerged in the final rule without any precedent in the proposed rule whatsoever. It was not even mentioned in the proposed rule. There was not the barest glimmer that that was coming until the final rule. Now, why does that matter? Well, if the EMS is going to be the concept that drives the forest planning process from here on out, shouldn't the public get a chance to know about that and comment on it before the Forest Service adopts it? And it's particularly bad when you're in a situation as we are here with the EMS. In the final rule, the Forest Service says, if you want to know what the EMS is, we're not really going to tell you here, but go to a website run by the International Organization for Standardization, and they'll tell you. Well, if you go to that website, you find out that you cannot, in fact, see this document or this model unless you pay $81 to them to receive it, purchase it from this international organization. So not only did the agency not provide notice of it in the proposed rule and give the public a chance to look at it, comment on it, see if it makes sense as being sort of the touchstone for forest planning from here on out, but even when it came out in the final rule, if you're trying to figure out what the agency had just pulled on you, you better have $81 in your pocket and access to a computer to get to the website of the International Standardization Organization. I don't think that's really the kind of public process that the Administrative Procedure Act is supposed to be fostering. So I think that's one of the issues that we're raising as well.
Okay, the first question that has to do with substantive protective provisions of the NIFMA, I guess that Mr. Presso mentioned earlier that he doesn't believe that the agency directive system is anything more significant than a New Year's resolution, and I guess I would take issue with that. One of the unfortunate components of this evening's discussion has been the fact that the directives package, which is intended for publication within the foreseeable future, has not yet come out, and that is in a lot of ways the rest of the story for the Forest Service. But because I can't reference those, I'm somewhat limited in how I can answer some of these questions. The substantive requirements of NFMA remain requirements. They're statutory, they can't be evaded, and they can't be avoided. And they will appear in more detail in that forum. The differences between the proposed rule that was published for public review in 2002 and the final rule, which came out a few months ago, were, in the eyes of some people significant, and in the eyes of other people less significant. The agency went through a great deal of debate on the question of whether or not an additional public comment cycle was needed, and eventually determined that the changes did not merit that additional review. Reasonable people differ on the questions of those types of questions.
Thank you. Your passion, all of you, it's so evident from everything that you've said and you speak of tonight. I'm struck, though, a bit by the difference in that passion. In particular, Bob Wolf spoke about each forest as a literal atlas, and the pieces, specifically the ecological knowledge, what we know about each place. We can contrast that with what Pam Gardner said about integrating data analysis and the range of ecological information that we have and we're able to run in different patches. I'm impressed with that, and I like what Martin Nye said about really sort of looking at this idea of questions, looking at this idea of experimentation, what groups here in Montana and all across the West and certainly in the East are doing as well, by really honing our questions, refining them, and getting back to this notion of efficiency. Somewhere in this process, I see knowledge has really caught up between this. On one hand, I see information. Bob Wolf is talking about stories, knowledge about particular places, in contrast to what Pam Gardner is saying, these ecological knowledge, this really specific information. To be more specific, I'm talking about hard science versus local ecological knowledge. Timothy Presso might describe that as knowledge that ranchers, backpackers, former trappers might have, really trying to flesh out this existence of place. So my question is there a Gordian knot to knowledge? Is this idea of two different knowledge systems part of catalyzing this debate, catalyzing the debate of how we can get beyond to sort of a new generation of planning and embrace knowledge and experimentation? Please, this question is directed to any of you who might answer. As my advisor, Jill, she's constantly trying to get me to condense, so I apologize for the long-winded question.
You've stunned and wowed.
I'll take a stab at it. It sounds like, you know, the dichotomy that you were describing is between more of an informal awareness of and sort of anecdotal relationship with ecological data and maybe the more research-oriented hard science approach. I would just, and there are, of course, components such as those. I would add to the picture, however, a component that we haven't talked about a whole lot tonight, although Martin did refer to political decision-making, but that is the whole question of humans' values and what value they place on natural resources, on scientific information, on sense of place. And I think that's a component that we often don't spend enough time exploring when we're talking about issues such as those we're involved with tonight.
I think I'd comment that sometimes we have when we're looking at a strictly value-based decision, that all the data in the world won't change it. Some of these things are questions of knowing enough about something. Other questions because I come out of a research background. Most Forest Service people are trained, at least in the past, as technologists. And, you know, we just knew more about it, we would certainly have a solution. And some of these things, it's not a matter of we don't know enough about it, we just don't agree. By God, I don't care how much you know about old growth. Some people say, by God, we're not going to cut any more of it. It's not because it's decadent or not growing fast. You know, what's the stand replacement rate? How much wood is that piling on versus this? That's not the question. The question is an internalized gut feel about things. And we don't deal with that in science very well. But boy, is it very real. I mean, I've had people tell you, lighten things up a little bit. We took the Secretary of Agriculture, his name was Espy when all this was going on, and he wanted to see, he's from Mississippi, and to him, something big was a loblolly pine and a cotton plant. And so he wanted to see what this old growth stuff was. And so we get him out. Jerry Franklin and I took him into this old growth stand, and Franklin wowed him for 45 minutes with the most wonderful discourse about old growth. And he's sort of listening, and we got out and he got ambushed by the press. somebody stuck a microphone in front of his face and said, well, you've been out with these two scientists for an hour and a half. What do you think, Mr. Secretary? He said, I think this was made by God and we should leave it alone. We had an hour scientific discussion. But he quickly caught on that that was not the issue. So sometimes there's not a technological solution to something that's a gut issue.
In fact, I think that, NIFMA arose from a dispute over, some people wanted logging and some people wanted to conserve these forests without logging. And Congress did not resolve that dispute. They punted and said, here's this planning process. That ought to help things. And so the fight just got out of the halls of Congress and into the halls of the Forest Service with the planning. And it's been that way ever since, and Congress has still never resolved this dispute. We're still fighting it out today, just like they were fighting it out in 1976. And I think that, nobody, I doubt anybody, including the Forest Service planners who spent hours writing these planning regs, has a real passion about planning. I doubt they get up every morning and they're just excited about thinking about planning and coming up with a planning reg. I don't think that's what they are. I doubt it very much. I don't care about planning, really. I don't think probably most people, what they care about is the national forests. They care about the roadless areas, or they care about getting jobs for loggers, or whatever it may be. They care about that. And so that's not going away. And I think, we can sit here and trade knowledge all day long, but until we, come somewhere as a nation and decide where we're going to come out on that, we're going to be going through these kinds of debates and disputes.
I don't, in my involvement in the process, I didn't feel that Congress was punting on the issue. I felt that they thought that the concept of multiple use was a reasonably sound one. The problem was how do you implement it? And they hoped that through using this planning process, the Forest Service would have more rational ways of dealing with the conflicts that they were facing. But there was no substantial sentiment in the committee or in the Congress to abolish cutting on the national forest, even though there were some who were making that argument. Just as there was no substantial view that we should abolish grazing. The members of Congress were not about to abolish uses. And so it was never an issue, the either or. We were going to try and deal with how do you resolve differences.
These sometimes are not totally just related to the national forest. If, for example, I would look for things to change for you students. I would look for things within your professional lifetime to be very dramatically different. We don't make steel in this country. We don't make aluminum. We're covering up our agricultural land with houses. For example, down here visiting one time, we were down talking to the fellow that builds homes, log homes south of Hamilton. He was looking at enough logs, dead lodgepole, that he could drop with a helicopter right in his log yard to keep him going for 2 years. And he couldn't touch any of them while they were rolling 6 truckloads of green lodgepole out of Canada into the log yards a day. So we're exporting our demand, which means we export the environmental consequences, but we also export the jobs and the money that goes along with it. And that's just one example of a whole lot of things. And sooner or later, we think about doing each other's laundry, I suppose. But if we look at the burgeoning public debt, held mostly by communist China, by the way, our deficit, trade deficits, et cetera, and so forth, I suspect we will take another look. On the other hand, I wouldn't look for us to go back 25 years to where we are today, but I would expect within a reasonable period of time, within your professional lifetimes, we'll be taking another look at these things. And that's what we probably should do. Times change, circumstances change. But I would bet you that if we were to up the cut off the national, my personal opinion, being internal to the Forest Service, when we were cutting 12 billion board feet a year, I was shuddering every year. Too much, too fast, and sooner or later we were going to hit the wall, and I could smell it, I knew it, and like a lot of us did, and we did. On the other hand, I'd tell you less than 2 going toward 1 is too little, too slow. But fortunately, we're a rich country and we have time to adjust. But I think we'll see some adjustment in that over the next couple of decades, and I hope we do it better.
You have a question?
Yeah, I guess I got to follow up on Mike's question and Martin's response to the idea of testing out different models, and that these are really ultimately political decisions, not hard and fast science decisions. And several of your comments on the subsequent questions really reinforce that. And so I guess I'd like to ask Mr. Presso to answer, do you think, as a way to move beyond these planning rule kinds of things, that utilizing some experimentation in different processes to really deal with the political nature of these struggles through our different value sets and the mix of those is a reasonable way to try and move forward? And then anybody else would like to comment as well.
Well, look, I'm not going to exclude any idea. I have to tell you that fundamentally, I'm probably the least qualified person up here to answer that question, because ultimately, I'm a lawyer, and I'm sitting here with the former chief of the Forest Service and some of these folks who've had 20, 30 years experience dealing with these planning things. So I really am not in as good a position to answer that as a bunch of other people, but I would say I would not exclude the idea of some experimentation of the type that Professor Nye talked about. I think it seems like a productive idea, but obviously the devil's in the details on all these things. But I think there's other people up here who can speak more intelligently about it.
Well, Tim may think he is not qualified to answer questions, but there's an awful lot of people in this country who aren't qualified to answer a lot of questions, and they have opinions on them.
And some of them are congressmen and senators.
And so it's never a surprise to me that someone has a view as to what should be done. They may do it from a wealth of knowledge or a wealth of ignorance, but they have a point of view. And my mother was completely opposed to my becoming a forester because she had a damn good reason. Her brother was a logger and he was a drunk. And she saw me going off in the wrong direction.
But no, I won't keep us any longer, but I would just say, I was actually surprised I said experimentation, to tell you the truth, because some of my current research is documenting all of the reasons why we should not be experimenting on most of our public lands. But I still think, what I'm trying to do is kind of catalog some of the benefits and the potential risks of such experimentation. And one of the big things that scares me so much when we do look at, because the devil is in the details, feed demonstration program, for example, was sold as an experiment, as was stewardship contracting and others. And some of these projects I like personally as a citizen, some of them I dislike. But as I dig into the congressional record and the hearings and all this other stuff, it quickly becomes apparent that a lot of members of Congress and their interest group sponsors, they don't want to learn anything. So I think a lot of us feel like, hey, let's experiment, let's try things, and let's try to glean some lessons and apply them elsewhere. I think if you take more of a political, realistic view of how political representatives view some of these projects, they see it as a vehicle to forward their pet ideologies, whether it's the commodification of public lands or whether or not it's the preservation of public lands. So I think we need to be realistic about the limits of experimentation as well. Although, again, some of the projects that I mentioned, I think, are certainly worth trying when it comes to NEPA, Valles Caldera and other projects as well. I just think we need to be realistic about it.
Martin, you sound like a politician. You're trying to have it both ways. No experimentation, but yeah, some experimentation. And I guess, back to the comment on the devil in the details, the devil's always in the details, and we're never going to escape the devil. And if we're going to move forward, we need to embrace the devil and wrestle with them. And we need to look at processes and I think try out some things that get down and dirty with the devil, and that's in each one of us, and work through those things and work on these political solutions.
Well, thank you for concluding a wonderful talk for us. I think this is an appropriate time. Do we have I think there's no other question, right? Well, I'd like to thank all of you for sticking with us and showing that citizens can not only listen but ask incredibly engaging, important questions. Thank you again for all the panelists for coming, for our audio, visual, camera, newspaper folks for sticking with us to the end. Thank you.